It is the winter of 1241 and Europe is ending. Not in metaphor, in immeasurable documented fact. In the span of just 2 days in April, two of the largest Christian armies ever assembled on the continent are destroyed in battles fought more than 300 miles apart. At Liegnitz, in what is now southwestern Poland, Duke Henry II of Silesia leads a combined force of Polish knights, Templars, and German miners against a Mongol column. They are annihilated. Henry's head is paraded on a lance before the walls of the city he was supposed to protect. 2 days later, at Mohi, on the Sajo River in the Kingdom of Hungary, King Bela IV watches his army collapse under coordinated assault from multiple directions. Tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers die in the marshes and on the roads during the rout that follows. Within weeks, Mongol patrols reach the outskirts of Vienna. The Adriatic coast is raided. Messengers carry the news west, and the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire begin preparing for what seems like an inevitable next blow. That blow never comes. But not because the Mongols were stopped. Not because any European army defeated them in open battle. The Mongols withdraw eastward in the spring of 1242, following the death of the great Khan Ogadei back in Karakorum. They leave behind a devastated Hungary, a shattered Poland, and a continent that will spend the next several decades waiting in fear for a return. And here is the question this documentary will spend the next 2 hours answering. How did the Mongols reach that point in the first place? Not just the military question, though we will answer that in detail, but the structural one. Why didn't the Mongol Empire behave the way every other steppe confederation before it had behaved? Why didn't it conquer one kingdom and then collapse, or raid a frontier and then retreat, or win a single war and then fracture into feuding successor states? Because that is the pattern. For centuries before the Mongols, the Eurasian steppe produced powerful nomadic confederations, the Xiongnu, the Gökturks, the Khitans, the Jurchen, and nearly all of them followed the same trajectory. They would rise under a charismatic leader, win a series of impressive military victories, extort or conquer a neighbouring settled civilization, and then, within 1 or 2 generations, they would either assimilate into the civilization they had conquered, or they would break apart from internal succession disputes. The steppe was not short on military talent. What it was short on was the institutional machinery to hold an empire together across vast distances after the initial conquest was won. That is the story everyone expected to repeat when a minor Mongol chief named Temujin began unifying the tribes of the eastern steppe in the late 12th century. It did not repeat. What happened instead was something that no one in China, Central Asia, Persia, or Europe was prepared for, a nomadic empire that did not stop. One that conquered the Tangut kingdom of Xixia and then turned on the Jin dynasty in northern China. One that crushed the Khwarezmian Empire across modern-day Iran, Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, and then kept going west. One that absorbed the steppe tribes of the Kipchaks, broke the power of the Rus principalities, and then drove into Poland and Hungary with armies that operated on coordinated timetables across fronts separated by mountain ranges. The Mongol Empire did not behave like a steppe-raiding confederation. It behaved like a centralized military state on the move, and that difference is what made it the most consequential land empire in recorded history. This documentary is not about one battle or one campaign. It is about the machinery behind all of them. The command system, the logistics network, the intelligence apparatus, the decimal organization of the army, the relay communication stations, the grazing schedules for tens of thousands of horses, and the political framework that allowed a ruler in Karakorum to issue an order and have it executed 6,000 miles away. None of this was accidental. None of it was simply the result of one brilliant man, although Chinggis Khan was unquestionably brilliant. It was the result of deliberate structural reforms, decisions about how to organize soldiers, how to distribute loot, how to absorb conquered peoples, how to manage succession, and how to project power continuously across terrain that no previous empire had been able to hold. And the key word there is continuously, because that is what separates the Mongol conquest from everything that came before. The Xiongnu could raid northern China, but they could not hold territory south of the steppe for more than a generation. The Gukturks could dominate the trade routes, but their empire split into eastern and western halves within decades. The Khitans built a sophisticated dual administration system: steppe governance for nomads, Chinese-style bureaucracy for settled populations, and that worked for a time until the Jurchen overthrew them. Every previous steppe power found a ceiling. The Mongols broke through that ceiling, and the question of how they did it, practically, structurally, logistically, is the subject we are going to examine from the ground up. To understand why the Mongols didn't stop, we first need to understand where they started, and how close the entire project came to failing before it ever began. Because the steppe in the mid-12th century was not a place of Mongol dominance, it was a place of Mongol weakness. The tribe that would later give its name to the largest contiguous land empire in history was, in the 1160s, a fractured, marginal group living in the harsh, northeastern corner of the Mongolian plateau, surrounded by larger and more powerful confederations. The Tatars to the east were stronger, the Merkits to the north were a constant threat. The Naimans controlled the western steppe. The Karaits, under their Khan Togrul, were the dominant power in the central grasslands. Temujin, the boy who would become Chinggis Khan, was born into this world around 1162, the son of a minor chieftain named Yasuge, who was poisoned by the Tatars when Temujin was still a child. After his father's death, the family was abandoned by their own clan. They survived on the margins, eating roots and fish, hunted by enemies, with no army, no allies, and no realistic path to power. The later Mongol chronicle known as The Secret History of the Mongols records this period with striking frankness, a future world conqueror reduced to stealing horses and killing his own half-brother in a dispute over food. Here is the thing that matters about this period, and it is not the personal drama. What matters is that Temujin's rise from this position was not fast, not easy, and not based on battlefield genius alone. It took him roughly 30 years, from the early 1180s to 1206, to unify the Mongol and allied tribes under his rule. 30 years of alliance-building, betrayal, warfare, negotiation, and repeated setbacks. He was captured and enslaved by the Taichi-Ud clan. He was defeated in major engagements. He lost followers, and had to rebuild his base multiple times. The process was grinding, iterative, and political as much as military. And it was during this long, difficult period of consolidation that the structural innovations which would later make the empire possible were developed, not as grand theory, but as practical solutions to immediate problems. The most important of those innovations was the decimal system of military organization. Before Chinggis Khan, steppe armies were organized along tribal and clan lines. A chief rode to war with his kinsmen. Loyalty ran along blood ties. Units were defined by family. This made armies fast to assemble but inherently unstable, because loyalty to the tribe always competed with loyalty to the confederation, and when the confederate leader died or showed weakness, the tribe simply rode home. Chinggis Khan dismantled this system and replaced it with something entirely different. He organized the army into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. The Arban, the Jagun, the Mingan, and the Tumen. Crucially, these units were not based on tribal affiliation. Men from different tribes were deliberately mixed together. Command positions were assigned based on loyalty and demonstrated competence, not hereditary rank. A herder's son who had proven himself in battle could command 1,000 men. A tribal aristocrat who had opposed Chinggis Khan might find himself serving as a common soldier. This sounds simple on paper. In practice, it was a revolution. It broke the tribal structure that had caused and that system was about to be tested on a scale that no one on the steppe had ever attempted. Because in 1209, Chinggis Khan turned south toward the first of the settled kingdoms that bordered the Mongol heartland. The target was Xixia, the Tangut kingdom that controlled the trade corridor running along the edge of the Gobi Desert. What happened next would set the pattern for everything that followed, and reveal whether this new kind of steppe army could do what none of its predecessors had done: take a fortified kingdom, hold the gains, and then keep going. The Tangut kingdom of Xixia occupied a strip of territory that ran along the southeastern edge of the Gobi, covering parts of what is now the Chinese provinces of Gansu and Ningxia, as well as portions of Inner Mongolia. It was not a massive empire, but it was a real state, With walled cities, irrigated farmland along the Yellow River, a standing army that included both cavalry and infantry, and a long tradition of playing the larger powers of the region against one another. The Tanguts had survived for 2 centuries by balancing between the Song dynasty to the south, the Khitan Liao dynasty, and later the Jurchen Jin dynasty to the east. They were skilled diplomats, experienced soldiers, and they knew the terrain. Their capital, Zhongxing, modern-day Yinchuan, was a fortified city surrounded by irrigation canals that could be flooded to slow an approaching army. When Chinggis Khan moved against Xixia in 1209, he was not launching a full conquest. The initial objective was strategic submission, to force the Tangut king to acknowledge Mongol overlordship, provide troops and supplies for future campaigns, and secure the Mongols' southern flank before turning east toward the much larger and more dangerous Jin dynasty. But even this limited campaign exposed a critical gap in Mongol capability. The Mongol army in 1209 was superb in the open field. Its horse archers could outmaneuver any cavalry force on the steppe. Its discipline and coordination were already far beyond what any rival tribal confederation could match. But it had almost no experience with siege warfare. The Tangut cities were walled, and the Mongols did not know how to take them. The campaign against Xixia went forward anyway. The Mongol army crossed the Gobi, defeated the Tangut field forces in the open, and pushed south toward Zhongxing. But at the capital, they stalled. The Mongols tried to flood the city by diverting the Yellow River, a technique they had no real expertise in, and the improvised dam broke, flooding their own camp instead. The siege dragged on for months. Eventually, the Tangut king agreed to submit, offering tribute, a daughter in marriage, and a pledge of military support. Chinggis Khan accepted and withdrew. Xixia was not destroyed. It was made a vassal, and the Mongols moved on. This outcome, messy, incomplete, and dependent on negotiation rather than total military victory, is important precisely because it shows the Mongol system in its early, imperfect stage. The army that would later reduce the great cities of Central Asia to rubble did not arrive fully formed. In 1209, it could not take a single well-defended city. What changed everything was what the Mongol leadership did next. They studied the problem and they solved it, not through some inherited tradition or steppe instinct, but through deliberate systematic adaptation. The siege problem was addressed in the most practical way possible, by absorbing the people who already knew how to solve it. As the Mongols expanded into northern China over the following years, they captured Chinese engineers, siege specialists, and soldiers with experience in the complex, technology-intensive warfare that the Chinese states had been practicing for centuries. These were not simply enslaved labourers. They were organised into specialised units within the decimal system, given defined roles, and deployed as integral parts of the Mongol military machine. Catapult crews, tunnellers, bridge builders, and operators of incendiary weapons were folded into the army alongside the horse archers. By the time the Mongols turned west towards Central Asia a decade later, they could field a combined arms force that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Steppe mobility married to Chinese siege technology, coordinated under a unified command structure. This is the pattern that has to be understood if you want to grasp why the Mongol conquest kept going. It was not that the Mongols were invincible from the start. It was that their system was designed to learn. Every campaign produced new knowledge about fortifications, about logistics, about enemy tactics, about governing conquered populations, and that knowledge was absorbed into the organization and applied in the next campaign. The army that invaded Khwarezm in 1219 was fundamentally more capable than the army that had struggled at Zhongxing in 1209, and the army that invaded Hungary in 1241 was more capable still. But before we get to the Western campaigns, we need to follow the war against the Jin dynasty, because it was in northern China that the Mongol system was truly stress-tested, and where the key logistical and administrative innovations that enabled the later conquests were developed under extreme pressure. The Jin dynasty controlled a vast territory stretching from Manchuria across northern China to the Yellow River Basin. Its population numbered roughly 50 million, compared to perhaps 1 million Mongols. It had a professional army that was large, well-equipped, and experienced. Its capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world, surrounded by multiple walls, defended by a garrison of tens of thousands, and supplied by a network of granaries and canals. The Jin were not some decaying relic. They were a serious military power, and they had been the dominant force in northern China for nearly a century. Genghis Khan launched the first major campaign against the Jin in 1211. The scale was enormous by steppe standards. Multiple Tumen, perhaps 60 to 70,000 Mongol and allied cavalry striking south across the frontier. The initial results followed the established Mongol pattern, devastating victories in the open field. The Jin army was built around heavy cavalry and infantry formations that were designed to hold ground. Against Mongol tactics, the feigned retreat, the encirclement, the relentless harassment by horse archers who could fire accurately at full gallop, those formations came apart. At the Battle of Yihuling in 1211, a major Jin army was destroyed in a mountain pass northwest of Zhongdu. Mongol columns then fanned out across the North China plain, raiding, burning and destroying everything in their path. But raiding was not conquering. The Jin court retreated behind the walls of Zhongdu. Regional commanders held fortified cities across the north. The Mongols could ride through the countryside almost at will, but the cities held, and the Jin war machine, damaged but not destroyed, kept producing new armies. This was the fundamental problem of steppe warfare against settled civilizations, and every previous nomadic confederation had hit it. You could win every field battle and still not control the territory, because the enemy's real strength was behind walls you could not breach, and inside an economic system you could not replace. The Mongol response was not a single breakthrough, but a sustained multi-year process of adaptation. First, they intensified the absorption of Chinese military specialists, not just siege engineers, but also administrators, translators, and defectors from the Jin court who understood the enemy's command structure, supply system, and political vulnerabilities. Second, they began exploiting the Jin dynasty's internal divisions. The Jin were themselves a conquest dynasty, Yuxian rulers governing a largely Chinese population, and that fault line could be worked. Mongol commanders offered terms to Chinese generals who were willing to switch sides, and many did, bringing their garrisons, their knowledge of local defences, and their administrative expertise with them. Third, and most critically for the long-term expansion of the empire, the Mongol leadership began developing a system for holding and governing conquered territory rather than simply raiding it. This was the point at which the Mongols diverged most sharply from every previous steppe empire. A pure raiding force takes what it can carry and rides home. The Mongols began appointing governors, darugachi, to administer captured regions, collect taxes, maintain order, and funnel resources back toward the army. They did not attempt to impose steppe customs on Chinese cities. Instead, they kept local administrative structures in place wherever possible, replaced only the top layer of leadership, and demanded two things: submission and revenue. The system was crude at first, but it worked well enough to turn conquered territory into a base for further operations rather than a vacuum that had to be reconquered every season. Zhongdu itself fell in 1215, after a prolonged siege that combined blockade, starvation, bombardment, and the exploitation of internal dissension within the city. The fall of the Jin capital was a defining moment, not because it ended the war, which dragged on for another 2 decades, but because it demonstrated that the Mongol system could accomplish what no steppe force had ever accomplished before: the sustained reduction of a major fortified city through combined military and administrative pressure. The siege of Zhongdu was not won by a single assault or a clever trick. It was won by logistics, by the ability to keep a large army supplied in the field for months, to coordinate multiple columns operating across a wide front, and to absorb the political and military resources of the conquered region into the war effort. And here is the structural factor that matters more than any individual battle. The Mongol Empire did not stop after conquering one kingdom because it had built a system that converted conquest into capacity. Every war produced captured engineers, defecting administrators, new tax revenues, additional soldiers, and expanded grazing lands. These resources were not consumed and discarded. They were integrated into the decimal structure and made available for the next campaign. The army that finished the Xixia campaign was stronger than the army that started it. The army that emerged from the first phase of the Jin War was stronger still. This was not an army that wore itself out through conquest. It was an army that grew through conquest. By 1218, With the Jin dynasty weakened but not yet fully destroyed, Chinggis Khan made a decision that would reshape the political geography of the entire Eurasian landmass. He turned west. Not on a whim, and not simply because a diplomatic insult demanded revenge, though the murder of a Mongol trade caravan and diplomatic envoy by the Khwarezmian governor of Otrar provided the immediate justification. The decision to invade Khwarezm was strategic. The Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II, controlled Central Asia from the borders of India to the Caspian Sea. It sat across the trade routes that connected China to Persia and beyond. It was wealthy, populous, and, on paper, militarily powerful. Shah Muhammad commanded an army that may have numbered several 100,000 soldiers, distributed across a string of garrisoned cities from Samarkand to Bukhara to Urgench. The conventional wisdom, then and now, was that the Mongol army, perhaps 150,000 strong for the Khwarezmian campaign, was badly outnumbered and operating at enormous distance from its home base. The campaign required crossing the vast grasslands of modern-day Kazakhstan, approaching Central Asia through terrain that included deserts, mountain ranges, and river valleys that the Mongols had never seen. By any reasonable calculation, the defenders should have held the advantage. They were fighting on their own ground, with interior lines, established supply depots, and local knowledge. What they did not have was a commander willing to concentrate his forces. Shah Muhammad, distrustful of his own generals, and fearful that a concentrated army might be used against him in a coup, distributed his troops across the major cities in static garrisons. He chose to defend everywhere, which meant he defended nowhere effectively. And this is where the Mongol command system proved its worth, because the campaign that followed was not a headlong charge into Central Asia. It was a coordinated, multi-axis invasion planned with a level of operational sophistication that would not be matched in Western warfare for another 600 years. Chinggis Khan divided his army into 4 major columns. His sons, Yochi, Chagatai, and Ogedei, each commanded a force assigned to a specific axis of advance. A 4th column, under the general Jebe, was sent on a wide flanking march through terrain the Khwarezmians considered impassable. The columns were given specific objectives, specific timetables, and specific instructions for coordinating their movements. They communicated through the relay messenger system, the Oto network of stations spaced across the steppe, which could transmit messages across hundreds of miles in days. This was not a horde sweeping westward in a mass. It was a distributed military operation, with each element executing its part of a larger plan. And the plan worked with devastating precision. While the main Mongol forces pinned down the garrisons of the eastern cities, Jebe's column appeared from an unexpected direction, deep in the Khwarezmian rear. City after city found itself isolated, unable to coordinate with neighbouring garrisons, facing Mongol forces that seemed to be everywhere at once. Bukhara fell in February 1220. Samarkand, the largest and most prestigious city in Central Asia, fell in March. The speed was staggering. Shah Muhammad, who had expected to fight a war of attrition from behind his city walls, found his entire strategic position collapsing in weeks. He fled westward, pursued by a Mongol flying column under Jebe and Subutai, 2 of the finest field commanders the empire ever produced, and died on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and abandoned by his own court. The Khwarezmian campaign did not just destroy an empire, it demonstrated something that the rest of the world had not yet fully understood, that the Mongol military system could project coordinated offensive power across distances that were supposed to be logistically impossible. The army that had struggled to take a single Tangut city in 1209 had, just 10 years later, dismantled the largest state in Central Asia in a single campaigning season. And it was not done, not even close. Because even as the main army consolidated control over the ruins of Khwarezm, Jebe and Subutai kept riding, northwest around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus, and onto the plains of southern Russia. What started as a pursuit of the fleeing Shah became a reconnaissance in force that covered thousands of miles and lasted 2 years. They defeated a Georgian army. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter. They smashed a coalition of Kipchak Turks and Rus's princes at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the first time a Mongol army had ever engaged European forces. And then, having completed what amounted to a full strategic survey of the western steppe and the military capabilities of its inhabitants, they turned around and rode back to Mongolia. That expedition, often called the Great Raid, was not a conquest. It was something arguably more dangerous. It was a detailed intelligence-gathering operation that mapped the terrain, tested the enemy armies, identified the political divisions, and assessed the logistical feasibility of a future full-scale invasion of Europe. Everything Subutai learned on that ride would be used 15 years later when the Mongols returned in force. And that is the critical point. The Mongols did not stop after one kingdom because their system was not built to stop. It was built to gather information, absorb resources, adapt to new enemies, and project power outward along every viable axis. Each campaign fed the next. Each conquest expanded the base, and each new enemy was studied, tested, and then overwhelmed, not by numbers alone, but by a level of coordination and operational planning that no opponent had ever faced before. The death of Chinggis Khan in 1227, during the final campaign against Xixia, could have ended everything. It was exactly the kind of moment that had destroyed every previous steppe empire. The death of the founding leader, followed by succession crisis, fragmentation, and collapse. And that is what the kingdoms of China, Persia, and the distant West expected to happen. They waited for the Mongols to turn on each other. They waited in vain. The succession held. Not cleanly, not without tension, but it held. And the reason it held was structural, not personal. Chinggis Khan had done something that no previous steppe ruler had done with comparable thoroughness. He had established a system of succession before his death, and he had embedded it within an institutional framework that gave the major stakeholders a reason to comply. The empire was divided into appanages, territorial grants assigned to each of his 4 sons by his principal wife, Berta. Yochi, the eldest, received the westernmost lands, including the yet-to-be-conquered territories beyond the Ural River. Chagatai received Central Asia. Ogadei, the 3rd son, was designated as Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the empire. Tolui, the young. This division was not a partition in the way that, say, the Carolingian Empire was partitioned after the death of Charlemagne. The appanages were not independent kingdoms. They were administrative zones within a unified imperial system. The Great Khan retained supreme military authority. The Ertu relay network continued to function across the entire empire. The decimal army structure remained intact. Tax revenues from conquered territories still flowed toward the central treasury, and critically, the principle was established that major military campaigns required the participation and consent of all the branches of the family, which meant that the empire's offensive capability was not divided, even if its administrative geography was. Ogadei was enthroned as Great Khan in 1229, after a 2-year interregnum during which Tolui served as regent. The Krultai, the great assembly of Mongol princes and commanders, confirmed the appointment. Ogadei was not his father. He lacked Chinggis Khan's personal intensity and strategic vision. But he was an effective administrator, a competent military planner, and, perhaps most importantly, a ruler who understood that the empire's strength lay in its systems, not in the charisma of any single leader. Under Ogadei, the institutional machinery of the empire was expanded and formalized. The Ertu system was extended, with new relay stations built across Central Asia and into Persia. A permanent capital was established at Karakoram in the Orkhon Valley. Not a great city by Chinese or Persian standards, but a functional administrative centre with warehouses, workshops, a treasury, and quarters for the foreign merchants, craftsmen, and diplomats who were now essential to the empire's operation. Ogadei also ordered a formal census of the empire's population, a project of enormous logistical complexity that required teams of administrators to travel across thousands of miles, count households, assess wealth, and register military-age men for potential conscription. The census was not an academic exercise. It was the foundation of a tax system and a military mobilization system that allowed the central government to know, with reasonable accuracy, how many soldiers it could raise, how much revenue it could collect, and where the resources were located. No previous steppe empire had attempted anything remotely comparable. The census transformed the Mongol Empire from a military confederation into something closer to a functioning state, and that state immediately went back to war, on multiple fronts simultaneously. This is the detail that is hardest for modern observers to fully absorb. The Mongol Empire under Ogadei did not fight one war at a time. It fought several, across a geographic span that stretched from the Pacific coast of Korea to the banks of the Danube. In the east, the war against the Jin dynasty resumed in earnest. In the west, preparations began for the campaign that would carry Mongol armies into the heart of Europe. In Persia, Mongol forces continued to suppress resistance and expand control. These were not independent operations run by local commanders acting on their own initiative. They were coordinated from Karakorum, sequenced to avoid overextending the empire's resources, and timed to exploit the political conditions in each theatre. The final destruction of the Jin dynasty is a campaign that deserves close attention, because it demonstrates the mature Mongol military system operating at full capacity against a determined and capable enemy. By the early 1230s, the Jin had been pushed south of the Yellow River. They had lost their original capital, lost most of their northern territory, and lost much of their army. But they were not finished. The Jin court had relocated to Kaifeng, one of the great cities of the medieval world, with a population of over 1 million and defences that had been strengthened over decades. The remnant Jin army was fighting for survival, and it fought hard. The Mongol campaign against Kaifeng in 1232 to 1233 was one of the most complex military operations of the medieval period. The city was too large and too well defended for a direct assault. Its walls were thick, its garrison was substantial, and the defenders employed weapons that the Mongols had not previously encountered in such concentration, including early gunpowder devices, fire lances, and explosive bombs that were thrown from the walls and caused significant casualties among the besieging forces. One Chinese source describes a weapon called the Thunder Crash Bomb, a ceramic or iron shell packed with gunpowder and shrapnel that could kill and wound soldiers within a considerable rate. The Mongol response, characteristically, was not a single tactic but a layered strategy. They cut Kaifeng's supply lines by controlling the roads and waterways leading to the city. They diverted rivers to flood the approaches, making relief operations nearly impossible. They bombarded the walls with catapults operated by Chinese and Central Asian engineers who had been incorporated into the army during earlier campaigns. They launched probing assaults to test the defences and identify weak points, and they waited. The siege lasted months, and it was the blockade, the slow strangulation of the city's food supply, that ultimately proved decisive. By the spring of 1233, famine inside Kaifeng had reached catastrophic levels. The garrison could no longer man the walls effectively. The Jin emperor fled south, and the city surrendered. The fall of Kaifeng did not end the Jin dynasty immediately. The last Jin emperor held out in a secondary fortress at Kaiju until early 1234, when a combined Mongol and Song Chinese assault finally destroyed the remnant. But the siege of Kaifeng was the decisive event, and it illustrated something essential about the Mongol way of war. The Mongols did not rely on a single battlefield victory to win a campaign. They used a combination of field operations, siege warfare, economic strangulation, psychological pressure, and political manipulation, all coordinated under a unified command and sustained over months or years. This was not the war-making of a nomadic raiding party. It was the war-making of an organized state, and it was made possible by the institutional infrastructure that had been built and refined over the previous 2 decades. Now, with the Jin dynasty destroyed and northern China fully under Mongol control, the empire possessed something it had never had before: the full economic output of one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. Chinese tax revenues, Chinese artisans, Chinese engineers, Chinese administrative expertise, and Chinese agricultural surplus were now flowing into the Mongol system. The army could be supplied on a scale that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Siege trains could be equipped with the most advanced military technology available anywhere in the world. And the manpower pool was effectively limitless, not because the Mongols themselves were numerous, but because their system could incorporate soldiers, labourers and specialists from every conquered population and deploy them wherever they were needed. This is the point at which we need to turn our attention westward, because the campaign that Ögedei authorised in 1235, the invasion of Europe, was only possible because of the resources that the Eastern conquests had generated. The Great Kurultai held at Karakorum in that year formally approved a massive western expedition, commanded by Batu, the son of Jochi, and guided operationally by the General Subutai, who was by this time the most experienced field commander in the Mongol army, and arguably the most accomplished general of the medieval period. Subutai had fought in every major Mongol campaign since the Unification Wars. He had commanded the reconnaissance expedition that reached the Kalka River in 1223. He had studied the terrain, the armies, and the political landscape of the Western Steppe and Eastern Europe. He knew what he was riding into. The army assembled for the Western campaign was enormous by Mongol standards. Estimates range from 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers, drawn from every part of the empire. It included Mongol cavalry, Turkic auxiliary troops, Chinese siege engineers, and support personnel. It required a logistical preparation that took more than a year. The prepositioning of supplies along the route, the designation of grazing areas for the vast horse herds that accompanied the army, and the coordination of the multiple columns that would advance along separate axes. Each Mongol warrior rode with a string of 3 to 5 remount horses. For an army of 100,000, that meant 300,000 to 500,000 horses, all of which needed grass and water every day. Managing that herd, keeping it moving, keeping it fed, preventing disease and exhaustion, was a logistical challenge on a scale that most settled world armies never had to contemplate. The first targets were the Kipchak. Some Kipchak leaders submitted and were incorporated into the Mongol army. Others fled westward, toward Hungary, where their arrival would later play a significant role in the political crisis that preceded the Mongol invasion. By the winter of 1237, the Mongol army was positioned along the Upper Volga, facing the fragmented principalities of Rus. And here, Subutai made a decision that revealed the depth of Mongol operational thinking. He chose to attack in winter. This was counterintuitive by the standards of European and most Asian warfare, where winter was a season for resting armies and waiting for campaigning weather. But Subutai understood something that the Rus princes did not expect him to understand. The frozen rivers of northern Russia were not obstacles in winter, they were roads. The ice turned every river and marsh into a flat, hard surface that Mongol cavalry could cross at speed. The forests that normally channeled and slowed movement could be bypassed by riding along the frozen waterways. Winter, for the Mongols, was not a constraint. It was an advantage. The invasion of Rus began in December 1237 with an assault on the city of Ryazan. The Ryazan Principality was the first to be hit, and it was overwhelmed in days. The city fell after a siege of just 5 days. The garrison was killed. The population was massacred or captured. The neighbouring cities received no warning and no time to prepare a coordinated defence. The Mongol columns moved with a speed that the Rus chronicles describe in terms that border on disbelief, covering distances that should have taken weeks in a matter of days, appearing at the gates of cities that had only just learned of the fall of their neighbours. Vladimir, the seat of the Grand Prince Yuri II, fell in February 1238. The Grand Prince himself was killed at the Battle of the Sit River in March, when his hastily assembled army was caught and destroyed in a forest camp. Moscow, then a small but strategically located town, was taken and burned. Suzdal, Tver, and a string of smaller cities were sacked in rapid succession. The entire campaign across northeastern Rus took approximately 3 months. By spring, when the thaw turned the rivers and roads to mud, the Mongol army withdrew southward to the steppe to rest, refit, and prepare for the next phase. The Rus principalities were not conquered in the way that northern China had been conquered. Through prolonged occupation and administrative integration, the Mongols established overlordship, demanded tribute, and installed representatives to collect it, but they did not garrison the cities or attempt to govern the population directly. This was a deliberate choice, driven by practical calculation. The forests of northern Rus were poor grazing land. The cities were small by Chinese or Central Asian standards. The economic return from direct occupation was not worth the cost. It was more efficient to leave the existing princes in place, compel their submission, and extract wealth at a distance. This system, what later Russian historians would call the Tatar yoke, would endure in various forms for more than 2 centuries. But the Rus campaign was not the objective. It was the preparation. Subutai had cleared his northern flank. He had destroyed any possibility of a coordinated Rus intervention in his rear, and he had tested his army against European-style fortified cities and armoured cavalry, gathering tactical intelligence that would be applied in the main effort to come. Because from the beginning, the primary targets of the 1235 Western campaign were not the forest principalities of Rus. They were the kingdoms of Poland and Hungary, the gateway to the heart of Christian Europe. And as the Mongol army rested on the steppe through the summer and autumn of 1240, preparing for the final phase of the campaign, the courts of Poland and Hungary received the refugees, heard the reports, and tried to understand what was coming toward them. They had fragments of information, terrified Kipchak refugees, scattered accounts from merchants, a few diplomatic messages from the Mongol court demanding submission. What they did not have was any real comprehension of what the Mongol army was, how it fought, or how fast it could move. They were about to find out. In the autumn of 1240, the Mongol army moved south and struck Kiev, the city that had once been the cultural and political centre of the Rus's world, the seat of the Metropolitan, the hub of trade routes connecting Scandinavia to Constantinople, was besieged in late November. The defences were substantial. Kiev sat on high bluffs above the Dnieper River, protected by earthen ramparts and wooden palisades reinforced over generations. But the garrison was insufficient. The political authority over the city had been contested for years among rival princes, and the Mongol siege train, now equipped with heavy catapults, battering equipment, and experienced Chinese and Central Asian engineers, was far more capable than anything the city's defenders had faced before. The siege lasted roughly 10 days. The Mongols breached the walls using concentrated catapult bombardment against a section near the Polish gate, then stormed through the gap. The fighting inside the city was intense but brief. The last defenders reportedly made a stand in the Church of the Tithes, which collapsed under the weight of people who had crowded onto its upper floors and roof. When it was over, Kiev was effectively destroyed. A Franciscan friar named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, who passed through the area several years later on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court, recorded that the city had been reduced to almost nothing. He counted barely 200 standing houses and described countless skulls and bones scattered across the surrounding fields. The destruction of Kiev served a military purpose beyond the immediate tactical gain. It eliminated the last significant stronghold between the Mongol army and the Carpathian passes that led into Hungary and Poland. It sent a message, amplified by the refugees who fled westward in waves, that resistance was not merely futile but catastrophic, and it freed the full strength of the army for the next phase of the campaign, which Subutai had been planning for months and which remains one of the most remarkable feats of operational coordination in pre-modern military history. The plan was this. The Mongol army would divide into at least 4 separate columns and advance westward through the Carpathian Mountains on divergent axes separated by hundreds of miles, attacking Poland and Hungary simultaneously. The northern columns, commanded by Princes Baidar and Kadan, would drive into Poland, defeat whatever forces the Poles could assemble, and prevent any Polish reinforcement from reaching Hungary. The main body, under Batu and Subutai, would push through the central Carpathian passes into the Hungarian plain. A southern column would swing through Moldavia and Transylvania to strike Hungary from below. All of these movements were to be synchronized so that the separate forces would arrive in their operational areas within the same narrow time window, preventing the European kingdoms from concentrating their strength against any single Mongol column. Consider the difficulty of what this required. There were no radios, no telegraphs, no satellite maps. The columns would be moving through mountain passes and river valleys that the Mongol commanders had never personally traversed, relying on intelligence gathered from captured prisoners, Kipchak guides, and the reconnaissance expedition of 1223. Coordination depended on prearranged timetables, the auto relay system extending as far forward as possible, and the professional discipline of commanders who understood that the plan required each element to be in position at the right time, regardless of whatever local obstacles they encountered. A failure of timing, one column arriving weeks late, or another being stopped in a mountain pass, could expose the separated forces to defeat in detail. The timing did not fail. In March 1241, the Mongol columns crossed the Carpathians and entered Europe within days of each other. The northern force under Baidar struck first into Poland, moving fast and hitting hard. The objective was not to conquer Poland. It was to destroy Poland's ability to send help south. The Mongol columns swept through Lesser Poland, burned Krakow after the city was largely abandoned by its population, and drew the Polish military leadership into a response. Duke Henry II of Silesia, the most powerful prince in fragmented Poland, assembled a coalition army at Legnica, modern-day Liegnitz, that included his own Silesian knights, contingents from Greater Poland, Bavarian miners from the Goldberg region, and a small force of Knights Templar. The army was respectable by regional standards. On April 9th, 1241, the two forces met outside Legnica. The battle followed a pattern that the Mongols had used dozens of times before, from the steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Central Asia, and that European opponents had never seen. The Mongol force engaged the European cavalry, exchanged blows, and then pulled back in what appeared to be a retreat. The European knights, trained to press a fleeing enemy, and accustomed to battles decided by the shock of heavy cavalry charges, pursued. The pursuit stretched the European formation, separated the cavalry from the infantry, and drew the leading elements into a gap between Mongol units that had positioned themselves on the flanks. At the decisive moment, the Mongols turned, enveloped the extended European line, and destroyed it in detail. Duke Henry was killed. His head, mounted on a Mongol lance, was displayed before the walls of Legnica. The Templar contingent was wiped out. The remnants of the coalition army scattered. The Battle of Legnica was a tactical masterpiece, but it was also a sideshow. Its strategic purpose was to knock Poland out of the war for the critical weeks, during which the main effort, the invasion of Hungary, would be decided. That purpose was achieved completely. No Polish force would threaten the Mongol rear. No Polish reinforcement would reach King Bela IV. The northern flank was secure. 2 days later, and more than 300 miles to the southeast, the main event unfolded on the banks of the Sajó River in northeastern Hungary. King Bela IV had been aware of the Mongol threat for years. He had received the Kipchak refugees who fled westward ahead of the Mongol advance, granting them asylum in Hungary, a decision that proved politically disastrous, as tensions between the Kipchaks and the Hungarian nobility led to violence, mutual suspicion, and ultimately the murder of the Kipchak leader Khoten by a Hungarian mob. The Kipchak warriors, the one group that had actual experience fighting Mongols, largely dispersed after Khoten's death, depriving Bela of a significant cavalry force at the worst possible moment. Bela gathered what he could. The Hungarian royal army, reinforced by contingents from Croatia, the military orders, and various baronial levies, assembled at Pest and then marched northeast to confront the Mongol main body, which had been reported moving through the Carpathian passes. The Hungarian force was large. Contemporary estimates vary widely, but a figure of perhaps 25,000 to 40,000 soldiers is plausible. It included heavy cavalry, infantry, and crossbowmen. Bela was not a fool. He understood that he was facing a dangerous enemy, and he advanced cautiously, keeping his army concentrated. The two forces made contact near the Sajó River, close to the town of Mohi, in early April. Bela established a fortified camp on the west bank of the river, using the wagons of his baggage train to form a defensive perimeter, a standard practice for medieval European armies operating in open terrain. Across the river, the Mongol army waited. What happened on the night of April 10th and the morning of April 11th, 1241, was the result of planning that Subutai had likely been refining since his reconnaissance ride through this same region 18 years earlier. The Mongol attack came in two prongs. Batu led one force against the stone bridge that crossed the Sajó directly in front of the Hungarian camp, launching a frontal assault that was intended to fix the defenders' attention. The assault was fierce, and the Hungarians resisted effectively. They pushed the Mongols back from the bridge with heavy crossbow fire and mounted countercharges. For several hours the Hungarians believed they were holding. They were not holding. While Batu pinned the Hungarian army at the bridge, Subutai had taken a large force on a night march southward, crossed the Sajó at a secondary ford that the Hungarians either did not know about or had failed to secure, and moved into position behind the Hungarian camp. By dawn, the Mongol envelopment was complete. The Hungarian army woke to find itself under attack from multiple directions, Batu pressing from the front and Subutai closing from the flank and rear. The result was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a systematic destruction. The Hungarian camp, packed with soldiers, horses and wagons, became a killing ground as Mongol catapults and archers poured fire into the compressed mass from elevated positions across the river and from the surrounding terrain. The heavy cavalry that was Hungary's principal striking force could not form for a charge. There was no room to maneuver, no clear enemy line to hit Here is the detail that reveals the sophistication of the Mongol approach. Subutai did not seal the encirclement completely. He left a gap, a visible opening in the Mongol lines on the western side of the camp, leading away from the river. This was deliberate. A completely encircled army, with no possibility of escape, will often fight to the death, because there is nothing left to lose. An army that sees an opening will run for it, and a running army, strung out on a road, abandoning its formation, dropping its weapons, shedding its armour to move faster, is far easier to kill than a surrounded army making a last stand. The Hungarians ran. They poured through the gap and fled westward along the road, and the Mongol cavalry pursued them for miles, cutting down the disordered mass at leisure. The casualties were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers died, not primarily in the camp battle itself, but during the rout that followed. Entire noble families were wiped out. The military structure of the Kingdom of Hungary was shattered in a single morning. King Bela himself barely escaped, fleeing south through Croatia to the Adriatic coast, pursued by a Mongol column that followed him all the way to the Dalmatian Islands. In the space of 48 hours, the two largest military forces in East-Central Europe had been destroyed in battles fought simultaneously on opposite sides of the Carpathian Mountains. There was no reserve. There was no second line. The road to Vienna, to Bavaria, to the heartland of the Holy Roman Empire was open. Mongol patrols reached the outskirts of Wiener Neustadt, south of Vienna. Raiding parties struck into Austria and pushed along the Adriatic. In Rome, in Paris, in London, the news arrived in fragments, each more alarming than the last. The Emperor Frederick II, locked in his own political struggle with the papacy, issued appeals for a united Christian defence but took no meaningful military action. No army assembled, no coordinated response materialised. Europe in the spring and summer of 1241 lay open, and the Mongol army that had just dismantled its eastern defences was resting and refitting on the Hungarian plain, grazing its horses on some of the best pasture land on the continent. And then the Mongols stopped. Not because they were defeated, not because they ran out of supplies, not because European resistance stiffened. They stopped because, in December 1241, news reached the army that the great Khan Ogadai had died in Karakorum. The succession was again in question. Batu, as the senior prince in the west, had a direct interest in the outcome of the succession struggle. Subutai, whatever his personal preference, could not sustain a campaign of conquest without the political authority of a sitting great Khan to legitimize it and ensure the continued flow of reinforcements and resources from the east. The institutional logic of the empire, the same logic that had made the campaign possible in the first place, now required the army to halt. The withdrawal began in the spring of 1242. The Mongol forces pulled back through Hungary, across the Carpathians and onto the western steppe. They did not leave because they had been beaten. They left because the political centre of gravity had shifted back to Mongolia, and the system demanded that the princes participate in the selection of the next great Khan. Europe was saved, if that is the right word, by the Mongol Empire's own institutional structure, the same structure that had made the invasion possible. The system that allowed Karakorum to coordinate campaigns across 6,000 miles also required that the commanders of those campaigns answer to the political centre when succession was at stake. It was not a weakness exactly. It was a design feature, one that prioritised the coherence of the empire over the completion of any single campaign. But the withdrawal did not mean the western conquests were abandoned. Batu established his capital at Sarai, on the lower Volga, and from there he ruled what became known as the Golden Horde, a Mongol successor state that dominated the western steppe, controlled the Rus principalities through tribute and political manipulation, and remained a major power for the next 2 centuries. The campaign of 1236 to 1242 had permanently reshaped the political landscape of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, even if it had not carried the Mongol border to the Atlantic. And the question remains, why did the Mongols get that far in the first place? Not just militarily, we have seen how the battles were won, but structurally. What was it about this empire, and only this empire, that allowed a nomadic confederation born on the eastern steppe to project sustained military power across the entire breadth of the Eurasian continent? The answer lies not in any single innovation, but in the interaction of several, and to understand that interaction we need to go back and examine the components of the Mongol system in detail, starting with the element that made everything else possible, the horse. Every army in history has been defined by its relationship to movement, how fast it can march, how far it can go before it needs to stop, and how quickly it can concentrate force at the decisive point. For the Mongol army, that relationship was built entirely around the horse, and the scale of that dependence is difficult for a modern observer to fully grasp. A Mongol soldier did not simply ride a horse. He lived on horseback, he fought from horseback, he ate, slept, and conducted the business of campaign life in the saddle, or immediately beside his mount. The horse was not a vehicle in the way that a truck is a vehicle for a modern infantry soldier. It was the foundation of the entire military system. Logistics, tactics, communications, and strategic mobility all flowed from the capability of the Mongol horse herd. The Mongol horse itself was a distinct breed, shaped by the extreme conditions of the eastern steppe. It was small, 13 to 14 hands, far shorter than the war horses of Europe or the cavalry mounts of the Islamic world. It was not fast in a sprint. It was not powerful enough to carry a heavily armoured rider at a full charge in the way that a European destrier could. But it had qualities that no other military horse in the world could match. It was extraordinarily hardy. It could survive on rough grazing, scrub grass, frozen ground cover, bark, that would starve a grain-fed horse within weeks. It could endure extreme temperatures, from the 40 below winters of the Mongolian plateau to the desert heat of Central Asia. It could travel 50 to 60 miles in a day, day after day, for weeks on end, without the elaborate fodder supply chain that every other cavalry army in the world required. This endurance was not incidental. It was the single most important tactical and strategic advantage the Mongol army possessed. A European knight's warhorse required grain, oats, barley, carried in wagons or stockpiled at depots along the route of march. That grain had to be grown, harvested, transported, and stored, which meant the army was tethered to its supply line. Move too far from your depots and your horses starve. Move too fast and your grain wagons fall behind. The operational radius of a European cavalry army was fundamentally limited by the carrying capacity of its baggage train. The Mongol army had no such constraint, or rather, its constraint was entirely different. Mongol horses grazed. They ate whatever grew on the ground they crossed. This meant that the army's operational radius was limited not by supply depots, but by the availability of pasture, a resource that was distributed continuously across the steppe and the grasslands of Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and northern China. As long as there was grass, the army could move, and because each warrior rode with a string of remount horses, typically 3 to 5, sometimes more, the army could rotate its mounts, resting tired horses while riding fresh ones, maintaining a pace of advance that no grain-dependent force could sustain. The implications of this were enormous, and they were felt in every campaign the Mongols fought. The speed of Mongol advances consistently shocked their opponents. The Khwarezmian defenders in 1220 expected the Mongol army to take months crossing the steppes of Kazakhstan. It arrived weeks earlier than predicted. The Russ's princes in 1237 expected winter to halt military operations. The Mongols used the frozen rivers as highways and moved faster than they could have in summer, but speed alone did not win campaigns. What made the Mongol horse system militarily decisive was the way it interacted with the command structure and the tactical doctrine. Because the army was entirely mounted, it could do something that no infantry-based or mixed army could do. It could divide into multiple independent columns, each moving at cavalry speed, and then reconverge at a predetermined time and place for a concentrated attack. This is the operational technique that we saw at Legnica and Mohi, and it was not a one-time improvisation. It was the standard Mongol method, repeated in campaign after campaign across different continents and different decades. Divide, move on separate axes, converge at the decisive point, overwhelm the enemy before he can react. The horse herd made the division possible, the decimal command structure made the convergence reliable. The management of those horse herds was itself a military operation of staggering complexity. An army of 100,000 warriors riding with 4 remount horses, Each meant 400,000 horses, plus pack animals, plus the herds of livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, that provided food on the march. Moving 500,000 animals across hundreds or thousands of miles required detailed planning. Which routes offered adequate grazing, how long a given pasture could sustain the herd before it was exhausted, where water sources were located, how to prevent disease from spreading through a concentrated herd, and how to time movements so that forward elements did not strip the grass before rear elements arrived. Mongol commanders assigned specific grazing areas to each tumen, staggered march schedules to avoid overloading any single stretch of pasture, and employed scouts whose primary job was not finding the enemy, but finding grass and water. This is the kind of detail that rarely appears in popular accounts of the Mongol conquests, but it was absolutely central to the empire's military capability. A Mongol campaign did not begin with a battle plan. It began with a grazing plan, the selection of invasion routes, the timing of offensives, even the choice of which kingdom to attack next. All of these decisions were shaped by the availability of pasture along the line of advance. The Mongol invasion of Hungary was launched in spring partly for strategic reasons. The Carpathian passes were clear of snow, but also because the Hungarian plain offered some of the best grassland in Europe, capable of sustaining the enormous herds that the army required. Conversely, the Mongols never attempted a sustained conquest of heavily forested regions, like northern Germany or Scandinavia, not because they feared the defenders, but because the terrain could not feed their horses. Here is where a common misconception needs to be addressed directly. The popular image of the Mongol army is one of pure cavalry. Horse archers sweeping across open ground, firing from the saddle and overwhelming enemies through speed and volume of arrows. That image is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete, and by the time of the European campaigns it was seriously outdated. The mature Mongol army of the 1230s and 1240s was a combined arms force that incorporated capabilities far beyond mounted archery. Heavy cavalry, armoured riders on larger horses, equipped with lances and maces, trained to charge in formation, formed a critical component of Mongol battle tactics. These heavy units delivered the shock attack that broke enemy formations after the horse archers had disrupted and disordered them. At Mohi, it was the heavy cavalry that drove into the Hungarian camp after the arrow barrage and catapult bombardment had shattered the defenders' cohesion. The siege train was another element that transformed the Mongol army from a steppe raiding force into a world-conquering military machine. By the 1230s, the Mongol siege capability included trebuchets, counterweight catapults that could hurl stones of several hundred pounds with considerable accuracy, as well as battering rams, siege towers, tunnelling teams, and incendiary weapons. These were not Mongol inventions. They were technologies absorbed from the Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian civilizations the Mongols had conquered, operated by specialist crews recruited or captured from those same civilizations. A siege train assembled for a major campaign might include hundreds of engineers and thousands of labourers, along with the timber, rope, iron fittings, and other materials needed to construct the machines on site. At Kiev in 1240, the catapult bombardment breached stone and earthen walls that had withstood previous attacks for generations. At Kaifeng in 1232, the siege operations included every technique available to medieval military engineering, sustained over months. And then there was the intelligence system, the element of Mongol warfare that is perhaps the least visible, but among the most consequential. The Mongols did not ride blind into enemy territory. They prepared their campaigns with a thoroughness that had no parallel in the medieval world. Merchant networks, particularly the Muslim traders who operated along the Silk Road and who were given privileged status within the empire, served as sources of information about the political conditions, military strength, terrain, and economic resources of potential targets. Diplomatic missions were dispatched not merely to deliver ultimatums, but to observe fortifications, assess the quality of enemy troops, and map routes of advance. Captured prisoners were interrogated systematically, not tortured for random confessions, but questioned in detail about specific military and geographic information by officers who knew what questions to ask. Subutais' reconnaissance expedition of 1221 to 1223 was the most dramatic example of this intelligence function, but it was not unique. Before every major campaign, Mongol scouts and agents operated deep inside enemy territory, sometimes for months or years before the invasion began. Before the invasion of Hungary, the Mongols had detailed knowledge of Hungarian political divisions, the tension between King Bela and his barons, the crisis caused by the Kipchak refugees, the weakness of the frontier defences in the Carpathian passes. They knew the road network, they knew the river crossings, they knew where the major cities were and how they were defended. This was not luck or natural instinct. It was organised, institutionalised intelligence collection, and it gave Mongol commanders a picture of the operational environment that their enemies simply could not match. The communication system that tied all of these elements together was the Ertur, the relay post network that Chinggis Khan had established, and that Ögedei expanded into one of the most extensive communication systems in the pre-modern world. Relay stations were positioned at intervals of roughly 25 to 30 miles along the major routes of the empire, each stocked with fresh horses, food, and water. A messenger carrying an imperial dispatch could ride at full gallop from station to station, switching to a fresh horse at each stop, covering up to 200 miles in a single day. Urgent messages could cross the entire empire, from Karakorum to the western steppe, a distance of more than 4,000 miles, in a matter of weeks. The military significance of this system cannot be overstated. It meant that the Great Khan in Karakorum could receive reports from commanders operating in Persia, China, and Eastern Europe within a time frame that allowed meaningful strategic coordination. It meant that orders could be issued and transmitted fast enough to adjust campaign plans in response to changing conditions, and it meant that the separate columns of a Mongol army operating across a wide front could maintain contact with each other and with the central command, not in real time, but fast enough to execute the kind of coordinated multi-axis operations that defined Mongol campaigning. This communication network also served a governance function that was critical to the empire's ability to sustain prolonged campaigns. Tax revenues, census data, administrative reports, and judicial decisions all moved along the Ertur routes. A governor in Persia could report to Karakorum. A tax collector in northern China could transmit revenue figures to the central treasury. The empire was not governed by a single mind directing every action. It was too large for that, and the Mongol leadership understood the necessity of delegating authority to regional commanders and administrators. But the Ertur ensured that delegation did not mean disconnection. The centre knew what the periphery was doing, and the periphery knew what the centre expected. All of these elements, the horse herds, the combined arms capability, the siege train, the intelligence system, the relay communication network, and the decimal command structure that organised them all, functioned as an integrated system. Remove any single component and the empire's military capability would have been dramatically reduced. Without the horses, there was no strategic mobility. Without the siege train, fortified cities could not be taken. Without the intelligence system, campaigns would have been launched blind. Without the Ertur, coordination across continental distances would have been impossible. Without the decimal structure, the army could not have absorbed foreign specialists, divided into independent columns and reconverged with reliable precision. This is the answer to the question that this documentary began with. The Mongols did not stop after conquering one kingdom, because they had built a military system in which each conquest fed the next, not just in the crude sense of looting wealth and capturing slaves, but in the structural sense of expanding capability. Chinese engineers made the siege of Samarkand possible. Persian administrators helped govern the territories that funded the invasion of Rus. Kipchak horsemen, absorbed into the army after their defeat, rode in the columns that struck Poland and Hungary. The system was designed to grow, and as long as the political framework held, as long as the Great Khan retained authority and the princes cooperated, there was no internal mechanism that would cause it to stop. The external mechanism, the one that actually did cause it to stop temporarily in 1242, was the death of the Great Khan and the succession politics that followed. And that brings us to the period after the European withdrawal, when the empire's greatest vulnerability was finally exposed, not on any battlefield, but in the tension between the institutions Chinggis Khan had built and the ambitions of the family he had left to run them. Ögedei's death in December 1241 did not immediately fracture the empire, but it exposed the fault line that had been present since the beginning, the tension between centralized imperial authority and the autonomy of the royal family's competing branches. The succession mechanism that Chinggis Khan had designed was functional but imperfect. The Great Khan was supposed to be selected by a kurultai of senior princes and commanders, but in practice the process was shaped by factional maneuvering, personal rivalries, and the distribution of military power among the branches of the family. The election was not a democratic process. It was a negotiation among armed men, and the outcome depended on who could assemble the most support before the assembly convened. The interregnum that followed Ögedei's death lasted nearly 5 years. His widow, Turagena Khatun, served as regent, a role that gave her considerable power but not the full authority of a sitting Khan. Turaghen was a skilled political operator. She spent those years building a coalition to secure the election of her son Guyuk, maneuvering against rival factions and managing the empire's administrative machinery well enough to prevent outright collapse. But the delay itself was damaging. Campaigns were paused or scaled back. Commanders in the field operated with reduced political authority. The coordination that had characterized the Ögedei period, multiple fronts managed from a single center, degraded as regional leaders increasingly made decisions based on local conditions rather than imperial strategy. Guyuk was finally elected Great Khan in 1246. He was capable but politically isolated. His relationship with Batu, the most powerful prince in the western wing of the empire and the ruler of the Golden Horde, was openly hostile. The two men had clashed personally during the European campaign, and Batu had pointedly refused to attend the kurultai that elected Guyuk. This was not a minor slight. It signalled that the western branch of the family did not fully accept the new Khan's authority, a fracture that threatened the unity on which the empire's military power depended. Guyuk reportedly began assembling an army and marching westward in 1248, ostensibly on campaign but possibly with the intention of confronting Batu directly. He died on the march. The cause is unclear, though illness is the most commonly cited explanation, and the empire was thrown back into another succession crisis. The pattern is worth noting because it reveals the structural limitation of the Mongol imperial model. The system Chinggis Khan had built was extraordinarily effective at projecting military power outward. It could coordinate campaigns across continents, absorb foreign populations, and sustain offensive operations for years. But it had no reliable mechanism for transferring supreme authority from one generation to the next, without a period of internal competition that consumed political energy and stalled military momentum. Every succession was a potential breaking point. The empire survived the first two, after Chinggis Khan's death and after Ögedei's, but each transition was more difficult than the last, and each one consumed years that could have been spent on further expansion. The third succession, following Guyuk's death, produced the leader who would preside over both the empire's greatest territorial extent and the beginning of its permanent division. Mongol Khan, a grandson of Chinggis Khan through his youngest son Tolui, was elected Great Khan in 1251 with the decisive support of Batu and the western branch of the family. The election was contested. Supporters of the Ögedei and Chagatai lines opposed it, and Mongol consolidated his position through a purge that was ruthless even by Mongol standards. Dozens of princes, commanders, and officials affiliated with the rival factions were tried, convicted of conspiracy, and executed. The message was unambiguous. The new Khan would tolerate no challenge to his authority. Mongol was, by most historical assessments, the most capable of the great Khans after Chinggis Khan himself. He was disciplined, austere, militarily experienced, and deeply committed to restoring the momentum of conquest that had stalled during the interregnum years. And he immediately launched the empire back onto an offensive footing, not on one front but on two, simultaneously, at opposite ends of the Eurasian landmass. The eastern campaign was assigned to Mungka's brother Kublai, who was directed to complete the conquest of southern China, the Song dynasty, which had survived behind the barrier of the Yangtze River and the mountainous terrain of the south while the Mongols digested northern China. This was an immense undertaking. The Song dynasty was wealthy, technologically sophisticated, and defended by terrain that was fundamentally hostile to steppe cavalry. The rivers, rice paddies, and forested hills of southern China were not the open grassland where Mongol mobility gave its greatest advantage. The campaign would require riverine warfare, naval operations, and a sustained logistical effort to keep large armies supplied in terrain that could not support extensive horse herds. It would take Kublai more than 2 decades to complete the conquest, and the methods he employed, river fleets, Chinese-style infantry, extended siege operations, and the co-option of Chinese administrators and generals, bore little resemblance to the classic Mongol cavalry campaigns of the earlier period. The Western campaign was assigned to another of Munka's brothers, Hulagu, and its objective was the destruction of the 2 major powers that still resisted Mongol authority in the Islamic world: the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the Ismaili assassin order in the mountain fortresses of northern Persia. This campaign would reshape the political landscape of the Middle East and produce consequences that are still felt in the region today. Hulagu's army departed Mongolia in 1253 and moved westward at the deliberate pace that major Mongol expeditions required, not because the army was slow, but because the logistical preparation for a force of this size demanded careful management of grazing, water, and supply along the route. The army was enormous, drawing contingents from across the empire. Estimates of its strength vary, but a figure of 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers is commonly cited, including Mongol cavalry, Turkic auxiliaries, Chinese siege engineers, and Christian Georgian and Armenian allies who had their own reasons for wanting to see the Abbasid Caliphate destroyed. The siege train alone was a massive undertaking. 1,000 teams of Chinese engineers, according to some sources, along with the materials and equipment needed to reduce the most heavily fortified cities in the Islamic world. The first target was the Ismaili assassin order, headquartered in the fortress of Alamut in the Alborz Mountains of northern Persia. The assassins had maintained their independence for nearly 2 centuries through a combination of inaccessible mountain strongholds, targeted political killings, and a reputation for fanaticism that deterred most potential attackers. Their fortresses were perched on mountain peaks that seemed immune to conventional siege. They had survived Seljuk attacks, Khwarezmian pressure, and the general chaos of the post-Khwarezmian period. They were considered by most observers to be effectively unconquerable. Hulagu did not share that assessment. The Mongol approach to the assassin fortresses was methodical and overwhelming. The army moved into the Alborz region in late 1256, isolating the individual fortresses and cutting their lines of communication and supply. Alamut itself was besieged in November 1256. The Mongol siege engineers hauled catapults up mountain paths that the defenders had believed were impassable for heavy equipment. The bombardment began, and the assassin leadership, facing an enemy that could not be deterred by assassination and could not be outlasted, surrendered within weeks. The Grand Master, Rukn al-Din Kursha, was taken captive and later killed. The remaining assassin fortresses were systematically reduced over the following months. An order that had survived for 160 years was destroyed in a single campaign season. With the assassins eliminated, Hulagu turned south toward Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate in 1257 was not the military power it had once been. The caliph's temporal authority had shrunk over centuries to little more than the city of Baghdad and its immediate hinterland, but it retained enormous symbolic importance as the seat of the Islamic Caliphate, the spiritual centre of Sunni Islam. The reigning caliph, al-Mustasim, seems to have badly misjudged the situation. He reportedly refused Mongol demands for submission, failed to mobilize an adequate defense, and relied on the assumption that the Islamic world would rally to defend the caliphate if it was seriously threatened. No such rally materialized. Hulagu's army converged on Baghdad from multiple directions in January 1258. The Mongol forces breached the irrigation dikes east of the city, flooding the ground behind the caliph's army and trapping it between the rising water and the advancing Mongols. The Abbasid field force was destroyed in a battle east of the city on January 29th. The siege of Baghdad itself began immediately afterward, with catapult bombardment targeting the walls and towers. The city held for less than 2 weeks. On February 10th, 1258, Baghdad fell. What followed was one of the most consequential acts of destruction in the medieval period. The Mongol army sacked Baghdad for days. The scale of killing was massive. Estimates in the primary sources range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dead, though the exact figure is impossible to determine with certainty. The Caliph al-Mustasim was captured and executed. Tradition holds that he was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, a method the Mongols used to kill royalty without shedding blood directly onto the ground, in accordance with their own customs regarding the treatment of noble blood. The great libraries of Baghdad, which had been centres of learning for 5 centuries, were destroyed. Books were reportedly thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water ran black with ink. The irrigation systems that sustained the agricultural wealth of Mesopotamia were damaged, and some were never fully restored. The fall of Baghdad sent a shockwave across the Islamic world that was felt from Egypt to India. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured in one form or another since the 8th century, was gone. The symbolic centre of Sunni Islam had been obliterated by a non-Muslim army. For communities across the Middle East, this was not merely a political event, it was an existential crisis. And Hulagu showed no signs of stopping. His army moved northwest into Syria, taking Aleppo in January 1260 and Damascus in March. The Mongol frontier now extended from the borders of Egypt to the mountains of Anatolia. The Ayyubid successor, states that had ruled Syria since the time of Saladin, were swept away. The only major Muslim power left in the region was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, a military state ruled by a caste of slave soldiers who had seized power from the last of the Ayyubid sultans just a decade earlier. The collision between the Mongol Empire and the Mamluk Sultanate would produce one of the most significant battles in medieval history, a battle that would, for the first time, demonstrate that the Mongol war machine could be stopped in the field by an opponent that understood how it fought and had prepared accordingly. But that confrontation, and the structural factors that made its outcome possible, is a subject that requires its own detailed examination, because the Mamluks did not defeat the Mongols through luck, or through some sudden burst of heroism, or because the Mongol army that reached Palestine. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was, in 1260, one of the most unusual political entities in the medieval world. It was ruled not by a dynasty in the conventional sense, but by a self-perpetuating military caste, men who had been purchased as slaves, mostly from the Turkic and Circassian peoples of the Eurasian steppe, brought to Egypt as boys, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood in the arts of war. The system was deliberately designed to produce professional soldiers whose loyalty was to the institution rather than to a tribe or family. A Mamluk soldier owed everything, his freedom, his status, his wealth, to the system that had raised him, and the training that system provided was among the most rigorous in the medieval world. Horsemanship, archery, lance work, swordsmanship, and small unit tactics drilled repeatedly until they became reflexive. This matters because the Mamluks were not simply another feudal levy or tribal confederation facing the Mongols. They were professional soldiers, and many of them were of Turkic steppe origin themselves. They understood horse archery. They understood the feigned retreat. They understood the tactical vocabulary of steppe warfare because it was, in a fundamental sense, their own vocabulary, adapted and disciplined through the institutional framework of the Mamluk training system. When the Mamluks studied the Mongol way of war, they were not studying something alien. They were studying a more advanced and larger-scale version of a military tradition they already knew from the inside. The man who would command the Mamluk army against the Mongols was Qutuz, a sultan who had seized power in late 1259 in a coup driven largely by the urgency of the Mongol threat. Qutuz was himself a Mamluk, a Turkic slave soldier who had risen through the ranks, and he understood that the survival of the Sultanate depended on confronting the Mongol advance before it reached Egypt. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 and the Mongol conquest of Syria in early 1260 had eliminated every buffer state between the Mongol frontier and the Nile Valley. If the Mamluks waited for the Mongols to come to them, they would be fighting on their own soil with no room to retreat and no allies to call on. Qutuz chose to march north and meet the Mongols in Palestine, to fight on ground that was still contested rather than ground that was already lost. The strategic situation in the summer of 1260 offered the Mamluks an opportunity that would not have existed a year earlier. Hulagu, the Mongol commander who had destroyed Baghdad and conquered Syria had withdrawn the bulk of his army eastward. The reason was, once again, succession politics at the imperial level. The great Khan Munka had died in 1259, killed by disease and possibly by a crossbow wound, during the siege of a Song Chinese fortress at Diaoyu in Sichuan province. His death triggered exactly the kind of succession crisis that had followed every previous Khan's death, and this one was worse than any before it. Munka's brothers Kublai and Arik Böke both claimed the title of Great Khan, and the empire split into armed camps supporting the rival claimants. Hulagu, who supported Kublai, needed to position himself to influence the outcome and protect his own territories against potential intervention by the Chagatai Khanate, which bordered his domain to the east. When Hulagu withdrew, he left a relatively small Mongol force in Syria, perhaps 10 to 20,000 men under the command of his general Kitbuka, a Naiman Nestorian Christian who had served with distinction throughout the Middle Eastern campaigns. This force was sufficient to hold Syria against local resistance, but it was not the full-strength Mongol army that had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate. The Mamluks would be facing a reduced Mongol force, operating at the end of a long supply line, in terrain that was less favourable to steppe cavalry than the open grasslands where the Mongols usually held their advantage. Qutuz marched north from Egypt in the late summer of 1260, with an army that probably numbered around 15 to 20,000 soldiers. He secured passage through the territory of the Crusaders. The two armies met on September 3, 1260, at a place called Ein Jalut, the Springs of Goliath, near the modern Israeli town of Ein Harod, at the southeastern edge of the Jezreel Valley. The terrain favoured the Mamluks. The valley was broad enough for cavalry manoeuvre, but enclosed by hills and ridgelines that limited the Mongol ability to execute the wide flanking movements that were their preferred tactical approach. Qutuz used this terrain deliberately. He concealed the bulk of his army behind the ridgeline south of the valley and sent a forward detachment under his most capable subordinate, the General Baybars, to make contact with the Mongol force and draw it forward. Baybars engaged Kitbuka's army and then pulled back, executing in effect the same feigned retreat that the Mongols themselves had used to devastating effect at Legnica and dozens of other battles. The Mongol force pursued, exactly as European armies had pursued in similar situations. Kitbuka pushed his men forward into the valley, following the retreating Mamluks, and as the Mongol line extended, Qutuz sprung the main body of the Mamluk army from its concealed positions on the flanks and rear. The battle that followed was fierce and prolonged in a way that Mongol engagements rarely were. The Mamluks did not collapse under the Mongol counterattack. They held their formations. Their archery matched the Mongol horse archers in volume and accuracy. Their heavy cavalry could absorb and deliver shock charges, and their discipline, the product of years of institutional training, allowed them to maintain cohesion even under the kind of pressure that had shattered Hungarian and Polish armies 2 decades earlier. The fighting lasted hours, with both sides taking significant casualties. At one critical moment, when a Mamluk wing was driven back and the line wavered, Qutuz reportedly threw off his helmet so his men could see his face, rallied the faltering troops personally, and led a countercharge that stabilized the position. Kitbuka was killed, either in the fighting or captured and executed shortly afterward, depending on which source you follow. His army, outnumbered, outflanked, and now leaderless, broke and fled. The Mamluk cavalry pursued, and the Mongol force in Palestine was effectively destroyed. Within weeks, the Mamluks reoccupied Damascus, Aleppo, and the other Syrian cities that the Mongols had taken. The Mongol frontier in the Middle East was pushed back to the Euphrates River, where it would remain for decades. Ein Jalut was not, by itself, the end of Mongol expansion into the Middle East. Hulagu and his successors in the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that governed Persia and Iraq, would launch repeated campaigns into Syria over the following decades, and some of them achieved temporary successes. But none of them permanently breached the Mamluk defensive line, and the pattern established at Ein Jalut held. The Mamluks could match the Mongols in the field when conditions were roughly equal. The question is why? What made the Mamluks different from every other army the Mongols had faced? The answer is not a single factor, but a combination of several, and each one is rooted in practical military reality, rather than in any abstract concept of cultural superiority or divine favour. The first and most obvious factor was professionalism. The Mamluk army was a standing professional force in an era when most armies were feudal levies assembled for a specific campaign and disbanded afterward. Mamluk soldiers trained constantly. They practiced mounted archery, formation riding, and combined arms tactics as a matter of daily routine. This gave them a baseline of tactical competence that feudal armies, even large and well-equipped ones like the Hungarian force at Mohi, simply could not match. The European knights at Legnica were brave and individually skilled, but they had never trained together as a coordinated unit against an enemy that fought the way the Mongols fought. The Mamluks had. The second factor was familiarity. The Mamluks understood steppe warfare because they came from the steppe. They recognized the feigned retreat as a tactic, not as a genuine rout. They knew that pursuing a retreating Mongol force was an invitation to encirclement. They understood the rhythm of Mongol battle, the horse archer harassment designed to disorder the enemy formation, followed by the heavy cavalry charge designed to break it. This knowledge did not make them immune to Mongol tactics, but it meant they were not surprised by them. At Ain Jalut, Baybars used the Mongols' own signature technique against them, and it worked because Kitbukar's force reacted to the feigned retreat the way opponents always reacted, by pursuing. The third factor was strategic preparation. Kutuz did not march blindly into Palestine. He chose his ground, he timed his advance to coincide with a period of Mongol weakness caused by Hulagu's withdrawal, and he used the terrain of the Jezreel Valley to limit the Mongol advantages in open field maneuver. This was not luck. It was the product of intelligence, gathered from refugees, merchants, and diplomatic contacts, that gave the Mamluk command an accurate picture of the Mongol dispositions in Syria. The Mamluks knew that Kitbukar's force was reduced. They knew that Hulagu was occupied in the east. They knew that the full weight of the Mongol Empire would not be brought to bear against them in the immediate term, and they exploited that window. The fourth factor, and in many ways the most important for the long-term survival of the Mamluk state, was institutional continuity. When Kutuz was assassinated shortly after Ain Jalut, almost certainly on the orders of Baybars, the Mamluk system did not collapse. Baybars seized the Sultanate and proved to be one of the most effective military and political leaders in medieval Islamic history. He fortified the Syrian frontier, rebuilt the defensive infrastructure of the region, established a network of signal towers and messenger relays that allowed rapid communication along the Mamluk defensive line, and maintained the professional army at a level of readiness that deterred further Mongol offensives. The system survived the death of the individual leader, which was, ironically, the same institutional quality that had made the Mongol Empire so durable in its early decades. The parallel is instructive. The Mongol Empire succeeded for as long as it did because Chinggis Khan built institutions that could function beyond his personal control. The Mamluk Sultanate survived because its military caste system produced leaders and soldiers whose competence was institutional rather than individual. Both systems were designed to outlast any single commander, and when they collided, the result was a stalemate that neither side could break decisively, because neither side had a structural advantage that the other could not counter. But the Mamluk success at Ain Jalut, and in the decades that followed, was also made possible by something that was happening inside the Mongol Empire itself, something far more damaging than any battlefield defeat. The succession crisis triggered by Munka's death in 1259 did not resolve cleanly the way previous crises had. It metastasized into a permanent division that shattered the unity of the empire and ended forever the possibility of the kind of coordinated multi-front offensive capability that had carried Mongol armies from the Pacific to the Danube. Kublai Khan and Arik Böke fought a civil war that lasted 4 years, from 1260 to 1264. Kublai won, but the victory came at an enormous cost. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia and the Golden Horde in the West increasingly operated as independent states, cooperating with Karakorum, or later, with Kublai's new capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, only when it suited their interests. The Ilkhanate under Hulagu and his successors maintained a closer relationship with Kublai, but even that connection was more diplomatic than operational. The empire that had functioned as a single strategic entity under Chinggis Khan and Ögedei was now 4 separate states, each with its own army, its own treasury, its own administration, and its own strategic priorities. They shared a common heritage and a common ruling family, but they no longer shared a common command structure. And without that common command structure, the machine stopped working the way it had been designed to work. The Golden Horde could not call on Chinese siege engineers for a campaign in Eastern Europe. The Ilkhanate could not draw reinforcements from the Mongol homeland for an offensive against the Mamluks. Each Khanate fought its own wars with its own resources, and none of them individually possessed the overwhelming combined arms capability that the unified empire had deployed. The system that had made the Mongols unstoppable, the integration of steppe mobility, Chinese technology, Persian administration, and centralized command, fragmented along with the political structure that had held it together. This is the final piece of the answer to the question we started with. The Mongols did not stop after conquering one kingdom because their system converted each conquest into fuel for the next. But they did eventually stop, not because any single enemy defeated them, but because the political framework that enabled the system to function as a unified whole broke down under the pressure of succession disputes that the system could not resolve. The centrifugal forces that had destroyed every previous steppe empire finally caught up with the Mongols, not in the first generation or the second, but in the third, delayed by the strength of Chinggis Khan's institutions, but not prevented entirely. The empire did not disappear overnight. The successor Khanates endured for generations. The Golden Horde lasted until the 15th century, the Yuan dynasty in China until 1368, the Chagatai Khanate in various forms into the 17th century. But the era of coordinated continental conquest was over by the 1260s, and it was over because the one thing the Mongol system could not do, transfer supreme authority smoothly and repeatedly across generations, finally proved to be a fatal limitation. What remains to be examined is the legacy of that system, what the Mongol conquest actually changed about the world they swept through, and what the military and strategic lessons of those conquests look like when stripped of myth and examined on their own terms. The Mongol Empire at its peak, roughly between 1227 and 1259, governed or dominated a territory that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the borders of Poland, from the Siberian forests to the Persian Gulf. No land empire before or since has controlled a comparable area. The question of what that control actually meant, on the ground, in the cities and pastures and trade routes where real people lived and worked and died, is more complicated than the military narrative alone can capture. Because the Mongol conquests were not simply a sequence of battles, they were a transformation of the political, economic and demographic landscape of an entire continent, and the effects of that transformation persisted long after the empire itself fragmented. The demographic impact came first, and it was devastating. The Mongol invasions killed people on a scale that the medieval world had never experienced and would not experience again until the Black Death, which was itself, in a grim irony, facilitated by the very trade networks that the Mongol Empire had created. Precise casualty figures are impossible to establish. The primary sources, Persian, Chinese, Arabic, Russian, European, all describe destruction in language that borders on the apocalyptic, and historians have debated for decades how literally to take those accounts. But even the most conservative modern estimates suggest that the Mongol conquests of the 13th century killed tens of millions of people across Eurasia. Some regions, particularly Khwarezm, northern China and parts of Persia, lost between a third and a half of their population through direct killing, famine caused by the destruction of agricultural infrastructure, and disease that followed in the wake of war. The destruction was not random. It followed a deliberate strategic logic that was integral to the Mongol way of war. Cities that surrendered promptly were generally spared, their populations were taxed, their skilled workers were conscripted, and their administrative structures were left in place. Cities that resisted were destroyed, and their populations were killed or dispersed. This was not cruelty for its own sake, though the human cost was no less real for being calculated. It was a policy designed to minimize the total resistance the Mongol army would face by making the cost of resistance so catastrophic that rational actors would choose submission. The destruction of Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, Baghdad, and Kiev, each one a major center of population, culture, and economic activity, served as object lessons that preceding Mongol armies carried ahead of them like a weapon in its own right. When Mongol envoys arrived at a new city demanding surrender, The inhabitants knew what had happened to cities that refused. Many chose to submit. The ones that did not were made into the next example. The economic effects were equally profound, though more uneven. In the short term, the conquests were economically catastrophic for the regions directly affected. Agricultural systems that had taken centuries to develop, irrigation networks in Mesopotamia and Central Asia, terraced farming in northern China, the carefully managed river systems of Khwarezm were damaged or destroyed, and some never fully recovered. The irrigation infrastructure of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which had sustained dense populations in Iraq for millennia, suffered damage during the sack of Baghdad and the subsequent disruption of maintenance that its canal systems required. Parts of Iraq that had been productive farmland in the 12th century were semi-arid wasteland by the 14th. But in the medium and long term, the Mongol Empire created something that partially offset the destruction: a unified political space across which goods, people, and ideas could move with a freedom and a security that had not existed before. This is the phenomenon that historians sometimes call the Pax Mongolica, a term that is misleading if it suggests peace in any conventional sense, but that captures a real economic reality. Before the Mongol conquests, a merchant travelling from China to the Mediterranean had to cross multiple political boundaries, pay tolls to a dozen different rulers, navigate shifting alliances and local wars, and accept the constant risk of robbery by bandits or extortion by officials. Under Mongol rule, a single political authority, or at least a network of related authorities that recognized each other's passports and trade agreements, governed the entire route. The Urtur relay system provided secure communication. Mongol law, the Yasa, imposed harsh penalties for theft and banditry along the trade routes, and the Mongol leadership from Chinggis Khan onward actively promoted long-distance trade as a source of revenue and strategic intelligence. The result was an expansion of Eurasian trade that connected regions that had previously been only loosely linked. Chinese silk, porcelain, and gunpowder technology moved westward. Persian textiles, metalwork, and astronomical knowledge moved eastward. Italian merchants, Venetians and Genoese in particular, established trading posts on the Black Sea coast that connected European markets to the Mongol-controlled overland routes. The Polo family's famous journey to the court of Kublai Khan in the 1270s was not a unique adventure. It was one instance of a much broader pattern of commercial and diplomatic exchange that the Mongol Empire had made possible. Marco Polo was remarkable, not because he made the journey, but because he wrote about it in detail. The transfer of technology across the empire was one of the most consequential effects of this connectivity. Gunpowder, which had been developed in China over the preceding centuries and refined into military applications during the Song and Jin dynasty wars, moved westward along the Mongol trade and military networks. Chinese siege engineers who served in Hulagu's army brought gunpowder weapons to the Middle East. Knowledge of gunpowder reached Europe by the late 13th century, and within 100 years it had begun the transformation of European warfare that would eventually render the armoured knight and the stone castle obsolete. Printing technology, paper-making techniques, and mathematical knowledge followed similar routes. The Mongol Empire did not invent these technologies, but it created the conditions under which they could spread across continental distances within a single generation. The administrative legacy of the Mongol conquest was more mixed. In China, where the Mongol Yuan dynasty ruled from 1271 to 1368, the Mongol period was later remembered primarily for its foreignness, a century of rule by non-Chinese outsiders who maintained a privileged position for Mongols and Central Asians over the native Chinese population. Kublai Khan built an impressive state, a functioning bureaucracy, a restored canal system, a new capital at Khanbalik with its massive palace complex. But the Yuan dynasty never fully integrated into the Chinese political tradition. The civil service examination system, which had been the backbone of Chinese governance for centuries, was suspended for long periods. Chinese officials were frequently subordinated to Mongol or Central Asian administrators who lacked knowledge of local conditions. When the Yuan dynasty finally fell to the Chinese rebel movement that established the Ming dynasty in 1368, The transition was framed explicitly as a restoration. In Persia, the Mongol Ilkhanate followed a different trajectory. The early Ilkhans, Hulagu and his immediate successors, ruled as non-Muslim overlords of a predominantly Muslim population, which created persistent tensions. But over the course of several decades, the Ilkhanid rulers gradually adopted Islam, patronized Persian culture, and merged into the existing administrative traditions of the region. The Ilkhanid court became a center of Persian literary and artistic production. The famous historian Rashid al-Din, who served as vizier under several Ilkhans, produced one of the most ambitious historical works of the medieval period, a universal history that drew on Chinese, Mongol, Persian, Arabic and European sources, reflecting the cosmopolitan intellectual environment that the Mongol Empire had created. The Ilkhanate collapsed in the 1330s, fragmenting into competing successor states, but its administrative and cultural legacy was absorbed into the Persian tradition and influenced the governance of later dynasties. In Russia, the legacy of Mongol rule was the longest lasting and the most debated. The Golden Horde's overlordship of the Rus principalities, which lasted in various forms from the 1240s to the 1480s, shaped the development of the Russian state in ways that historians still argue about. The Mongol period centralized political authority in the hands of princes who cooperated with the Golden Horde, particularly the princes of Moscow, who served as the primary tax collectors for the Mongol overlords, and used that position to accumulate power at the expense of rival principalities. The census and taxation systems imposed by the Mongols provided models for the administrative machinery of the emerging Muscovite state. The relay communication system influenced the development of the Russian postal service, and the experience of Mongol rule, the subordination to a foreign power, the requirement of tribute, the constant threat of punitive raids, became a defining element of Russian historical memory, shaping attitudes towards centralized authority, frontier defense, and relations with the steppe peoples for centuries afterward. But the most important legacy of the Mongol conquests, the one that matters most for understanding why the empire did what it did and what it means in the longer arc of military and political history, is the demonstration effect. The Mongol Empire proved that a nomadic power could build and sustain an institutional framework capable of projecting military force across the entire breadth of the Eurasian continent. It proved that the steppe cavalry tradition, when combined with absorbed technologies, integrated administration, and centralized command, could overcome every type of defense that the settled civilizations of the medieval world could construct. And it proved that the critical variable was not individual genius or cultural superiority, but organizational design, the ability to build a system that could learn, adapt, expand, and function beyond the control of any single leader. That proof changed the calculations of every state within the Mongol sphere of influence for generations. The Ming dynasty in China invested heavily in wall building and frontier defense, precisely because the Mongol threat remained real even after the Yuan dynasty fell. The Mamluk Sultanate maintained its military caste system and its permanent state of readiness, because the Ilkhanate and its successors kept probing the Syrian frontier. The Russian principalities organized their political development around the need to first accommodate and then eventually overthrow Mongol overlordship. The Timurid Empire, Tamerlane's domain, which arose in Central Asia in the late 14th century, was explicitly modelled on Mongol precedents, claiming Chinggisid legitimacy and employing Mongol military and administrative methods. Even in Western Europe, which the Mongols never permanently occupied, the fear generated by the 1241 invasion had lasting effects. The Hungarian kingdom undertook a comprehensive program of castle building and military reform after the Mongol withdrawal, a program that, as we will examine in detail, transformed Hungary's defensive capability and played a significant role in deterring a potential second Mongol invasion. The papacy dispatched diplomatic missions to the Mongol court, the journeys of Giovanni da Pian del Carpini in 1245 and William of Rubruck in 1253, that produced some of the most detailed European accounts of the Mongol Empire and opened a channel of communication that, for a time, raised the possibility of a Mongol. The world the Mongols made was not the world they intended to make. Chinggis Khan did not set out to facilitate the transfer of gunpowder technology to Europe or to create the conditions for the rise of Moscow. He set out to unify the steppe, secure his borders, and punish those who defied him. But the system he built, the decimal army, the relay network, the administrative framework, the policy of absorbing and integrating conquered peoples and technologies, had consequences that far exceeded any individual intention. The Mongol Empire was, in a sense, a machine that was more powerful than its operators fully understood, and when it was finally fragmented by the political forces it could not contain, the pieces it left behind reshaped every civilization they touched. We have now traced the arc of the empire from its origins on the eastern steppe to its fragmentation in the 1260s, and we have examined the structural factors that allowed it to sustain conquest across a span of territory and time that no nomadic power had ever achieved. But there is one more dimension of the story that deserves close attention: the question of what happened when the Mongol system encountered an enemy that had time to prepare, and what the Mongol response reveals about the limits of even the most effective military organization. That story takes us back to Hungary, not the Hungary of 1241, shattered and defenseless after Mohi, but the Hungary of the 1280s and 1290s, rebuilt, reformed, and waiting. When the Mongol army withdrew from Hungary in the spring of 1242, it left behind a kingdom that had been gutted. The scale of the destruction was staggering even by the standards of a century defined by Mongol invasions. Modern estimates suggest that Hungary lost between 15 and 25% of its total population during the invasion and its immediate aftermath, through direct killing, famine caused by the destruction of crops and livestock, and the displacement of entire communities that fled westward and never returned. The eastern half of the country, the great plain that had attracted the Mongols precisely because of its excellent pasture land, was the worst affected. Villages were burned, towns were sacked. The agricultural workforce that sustained the rural economy was killed or scattered. In some districts, the population loss approached 50%. King Bela IV survived. He had fled south during the rout at Mohi, crossed into Croatia, and eventually reached the Dalmatian coast, where Mongol pursuit columns lost track of him among the islands of the Adriatic. He returned to a devastated kingdom in 1242, and he spent the remaining 28 years of his reign engaged in what amounted to a comprehensive reconstruction of Hungarian military and civil infrastructure, driven by a single, overriding strategic assessment: the Mongols would come back. That assessment was not paranoia. It was a rational calculation based on observable Mongol behaviour. The Mongols had withdrawn from Hungary for political reasons, the death of Yögödei and the succession crisis that followed, not because they had been defeated or because they had decided that Hungary was not worth holding. The western steppe and the Hungarian plain remained strategically valuable as grazing land and as a base for further operations into Central Europe. The Golden Horde, established under Batu on the lower Volga, maintained its interest in the westernmost reaches of the steppe, and Mongol raiding parties continued to probe the Carpathian frontier throughout the 1240s and 1250s. Bela understood that the withdrawal was a pause, not a conclusion. The reform program that Bela implemented over the following decades addressed the specific vulnerabilities that the 1241 invasion had exposed, and it did so with a practicality that reflected hard-won experience rather than theoretical abstraction. The most visible element of the program was a massive campaign of castle construction. Before 1241, Hungary had relatively few stone fortifications. The kingdom's defence had relied primarily on field armies, the royal host and the baronial cavalry levies that could be assembled for a major campaign. The Mongol invasion had demonstrated with lethal clarity that field armies alone were insufficient against an enemy that was faster, more mobile and tactically superior in open terrain. The Hungarian army at Mohi had been one of the largest forces in European history up to that point, and it had been destroyed in a single morning. Bela's conclusion was straightforward. Hungary needed fortifications that could survive even if the field army was defeated. He encouraged, and in many cases directly funded, the construction of stone castles across the kingdom, with particular emphasis on the highland regions along the Carpathian frontier and the hilly terrain of western and northern Hungary. The castles were not merely noble residences or symbols of feudal authority. They were military installations designed to control key passes, river crossings, and road junctions. They were positioned so that a Mongol army advancing across the plain would find its supply lines and lines of communication threatened by garrisons operating from fortified positions on the high ground, and they were built of stone, a material that the Mongol siege train, formidable as it was, could not reduce as quickly or as easily as the wooden palisades and earthen ramparts that had characterized Hungarian fortifications before 1241. The scale of this construction program was remarkable. Before the Mongol invasion, Hungary had perhaps a few dozen stone castles of any military significance. By the end of the 13th century, the number had grown to several hundred. The landscape of the kingdom was transformed. Where a Mongol army in 1241 had swept across open terrain and encountered almost no fixed defences between the Carpathian passes and the gates of Pest, a Mongol army attempting the same advance in the 1280s would have faced a network of stone fortresses, each one requiring a siege to reduce, each one consuming time and resources that a fast-moving cavalry force could not afford to spend. The castle-building program was complemented by changes in the composition and training of the Hungarian military forces themselves. Bela recognised that the Hungarian army needed more cavalry, specifically more light cavalry capable of operating in the fast, fluid style that the Mongol army employed. The heavy cavalry charge that was the signature tactic of European feudal warfare was too slow and too rigid to counter Mongol manoeuvre. Bela invited Kipchak refugees, the same Turkic nomads who had fled the Mongol advance in the 1230s, to settle in Hungary, granting them land on the Great Plain in exchange for military service. The Kipchaks brought with them the horse archery skills and the tactical instincts of the steppe, and they provided the Hungarian crown with a cavalry force that could, at least partially, match the Mongol army's speed and tactical flexibility. Bela also reformed the feudal military obligation, seeking to increase the number of armoured cavalry available for royal service, and to improve the speed with which they could be mobilised. The experience of 1241 had shown that the traditional system, in which barons assembled their retinues in response to a royal summons, a process that could take weeks, was far too slow to respond to a Mongol invasion that could cross the Carpathians and reach the Hungarian plain in days. The reformed system aimed to keep a larger proportion of the kingdom's military strength in a higher state of readiness, with pre-designated assembly points and faster mobilization procedures. These reforms were expensive. The castle-building program alone consumed a significant portion of the royal treasury, and Bela supplemented royal funds by granting land and privileges to nobles who built castles at their own expense, a policy that had the unintended long-term consequence of strengthening the Hungarian baronial class at the expense of royal authority. The military reforms required ongoing expenditure on training, equipment, and the maintenance of the Kipchak settlements. The economic burden was substantial for a kingdom that was still recovering from the devastation of 1241, but Bela judged correctly that the cost of preparation was less than the cost of another undefended invasion. The strategic logic of Bela's program was not original. It was, in fact, a recognition of the same principle that the Chinese states had applied for centuries in their dealings with steppe powers. When you cannot match a nomadic army in the open field, you change the terms of the engagement. You build walls. You create fixed points that the enemy must either take or bypass, and you make the taking expensive enough in time and casualties that the enemy's operational timeline is disrupted. You use terrain, hills, rivers, forests, fortified passes, to channel and slow the enemy's advance. You deny. This was not a guarantee of success. Fortifications could be starved out. Garrisons could be overwhelmed if the attacker was willing to pay the price, and the Mongol army had demonstrated, at Kaifeng and Baghdad and dozens of other cities, that it was fully capable of reducing even the strongest fortifications when it committed its full siege capability to the task. But siege warfare consumed the one resource that a Mongol army on a long-distance campaign could not easily replenish: time. Every week spent besieging a castle was a week during which the army's horses consumed the available grazing. The campaigning season shortened, and the risk of a counterattack or a political crisis at home increased. A landscape dense with stone fortifications did not make invasion impossible. It made invasion slow. And slow was something the Mongol system was not designed to be. The test came in 1285, when a major Mongol force, dispatched by the Golden Horde under the command of Nogai Khan and the Mongol prince Talabuga, invaded Hungary through the Carpathian passes. The invasion was large enough to constitute a serious military threat, though the exact size of the force is debated in the sources. It was not a raid. It was an attempted repetition of the 1241 campaign, a full-scale invasion aimed at reasserting Mongol dominance over the Hungarian plain. The results were dramatically different from 1241. The Mongol columns crossed the Carpathians and entered the eastern Hungarian plain, but they immediately encountered the transformed defensive landscape that Bela's reform program had created. Stone castles controlled the passes and the river crossings. Garrisons held fortified positions on the high ground overlooking the routes of advance. The Mongol army could move across the open plain, but it could not secure its supply lines or its rear while hostile garrisons remained active in the hills on either side. The Hungarian response was also different. Rather than assembling a single large field army and marching out to meet the Mongols in a decisive pitched battle, the approach that had led to catastrophe at Mohi, the Hungarian forces fought a dispersed defensive campaign. Garrisons held their castles. Mobile forces, including the Kipchak-like cavalry that Bela had settled on the plain, harassed the Mongol columns, attacked foraging parties, and avoided the kind of set-piece engagement where Mongol tactical superiority was most dangerous. The Hungarian commanders had learned painfully that fighting the Mongols on their terms was a losing proposition. They fought instead on their own terms, trading space for time, using the fortified landscape to fragment the Mongol advance, and denying the invaders the concentrated target that their tactical system was designed to destroy. The 1285 invasion failed. The Mongol force was unable to take any of the major fortified positions, unable to bring the Hungarian army to a decisive battle on favourable terms, and unable to sustain itself in the field long enough to grind down the defensive network through sheer persistence. The army withdrew back through the Carpathians, having inflicted damage but having achieved none of its strategic objectives. A second Mongol incursion in 1287 produced a similar outcome: an advance onto the plain, an inability to crack the defensive infrastructure, and a withdrawal without lasting territorial gain. These campaigns are not well known outside specialist circles. They lack the dramatic clarity of Mohi or Ain Jalut. There was no single decisive battle, no moment of catastrophic collapse or triumphant reversal. But their significance is profound, because they demonstrated something that the Mongol Empire had rarely encountered in its decades of continental conquest: a prepared defence that the Mongol system could not overcome within the operational window that a campaign allowed. The Hungarian defence worked not because the Hungarians had discovered some secret weapon, or because the Mongol army had suddenly become incompetent. It worked because Bela IV and his successors had correctly identified the structural factors that had made the 1241 invasion so devastating: the absence of fixed defences, the reliance on a single field army, the inability to match Mongol mobility, and had systematically addressed each one through decades of sustained investment and reform. The castles changed the calculus of invasion. The Kipchak cavalry changed the balance of mobility. The dispersed defensive strategy changed the tactical dynamic. None of these changes, individually, was revolutionary. Together, they transformed Hungary from a kingdom that could be overrun in weeks into a kingdom that could absorb and survive a Mongol invasion. And this is the broader lesson embedded in the Hungarian experience, a lesson that applies not just to the Mongol period, but to the general problem of facing a militarily superior adversary. Survival against an overwhelming threat is rarely the product of a single brilliant stroke. It is almost always the product of systematic preparation, the identification of specific vulnerabilities, the development of specific countermeasures, and the sustained investment of resources over time to implement those countermeasures before the threat materializes. Bela IV did not defeat the Mongols in 1285, he was dead by then. But the system he built, the castles, the reformed military, the Kipchak settlers, the strategic doctrine of dispersed defense, outlasted him and did the job he had designed it to do. The Mongol Empire, for all its extraordinary achievements, was ultimately constrained by the same factors that constrain every military system: time, distance, politics, and the capacity of opponents to learn. The Empire's greatest strength was its ability to learn from each campaign and apply those lessons to the next. But that learning was not unique to the Mongols. Their enemies could learn too. And when an enemy had enough time, enough resources, and enough institutional continuity to study the Mongol system and build a deliberate counter to it, as the Mamluks did, as the Hungarians did, as the southern Song Chinese did for decades before finally being overwhelmed, The aura of invincibility that surrounded the Mongol army began to crack. The cracks did not appear because the Mongol system had failed. They appeared because the system's internal political contradictions, the succession crises, the fragmentation into rival khanates, the loss of centralized coordination, prevented it from bringing its full, unified strength to bear against enemies who had used the breathing space to prepare. The Mongols at full strength, operating under unified command with the resources of the entire empire behind them, might well have overcome Hungary's castles, the Mamluk army, and every other obstacle in their path. But full strength and unified command were exactly what the post-1260 Mongol world could no longer produce. What the Mongol conquests leave us with, then, is not a simple story of invincible conquerors eventually brought low, but something more instructive, a demonstration of what organized military power can achieve when its institutional foundations are sound, and a demonstration of what happens when those foundations erode. There is a tendency, when examining the Mongol Empire from the distance of 8 centuries, to treat it as a force of nature, something that swept across the continent with the inevitability of a geological event, beyond the capacity of any individual or society to resist. That framing is understandable. The scale of the conquests, the speed of the campaigns, the sheer geographic reach of the empire, all of it can seem so overwhelming that resistance appears futile by definition. But that framing is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that obscures the most important lessons the Mongol period has to offer. The Mongol Empire was not a force of nature. It was a human institution, built by specific people making specific decisions under specific constraints. It succeeded when those decisions were sound and the institution functioned as designed. It failed, or at least stalled, when the decisions were poor, the institution malfunctioned, or the opposition had done its own work well enough to change the terms of the contest. Every Mongol campaign, no matter how dramatic the outcome, can be traced back to identifiable factors. The quality of intelligence, the management of logistics, the coordination of command, the political cohesion of the leadership, and the preparedness, or lack of preparedness, of the enemy. There is no mysticism in the Mongol story. There is only organization, applied with extraordinary discipline across extraordinary distances. Consider the contrast between the Mongol experience in Central Asia and the Mongol experience in Southeast Asia, because it illustrates this point with particular clarity. In Central Asia, the Mongols faced an enemy, Shah Muhammad of Khwarezm, who made nearly every mistake available to. Now consider what happened when the Mongol Empire attempted to project power into Southeast Asia, specifically the invasions of Vietnam and Java under Kublai Khan in the 1280s. In Vietnam, the Mongol army, operating under the Yuan dynasty's authority and reinforced by Chinese infantry and naval forces, invaded the Dai Viet kingdom 3 times between 1257 and 1288. The Vietnamese commander Tran Hung Dao employed a strategy that was, in its essentials, the inverse of everything Shah Muhammad had done. He avoided pitched battles on open ground where Mongol cavalry held the advantage. He withdrew into the forests and highlands, trading territory for time. He used the tropical terrain, dense jungle, river systems, monsoon flooding, to neutralize Mongol mobility. He attacked supply lines, ambushed foraging parties, and targeted the Mongol army's logistical vulnerabilities, rather than its combat strength. And he waited for the climate to do its work. The heat, the humidity, the tropical diseases to which steppe soldiers had no immunity, and the difficulty of feeding horses in jungle terrain all degraded the Mongol force faster than any battle could have. The third Mongol invasion of Vietnam in 1287 to 1288 ended in decisive defeat. The Vietnamese destroyed the Mongol supply fleet on the Bac Dang River, using iron-tipped wooden stakes planted in the riverbed, a tactic that exploited the tidal patterns of the river to trap and wreck the enemy vessels as the tide receded. The Mongol army, cut off from its naval supply line and unable to sustain itself in hostile terrain, was forced to withdraw. The losses during the retreat were severe. Vietnam remained independent. The invasion of Java in 1293 followed a similar pattern of initial advance followed by logistical failure and withdrawal. Kublai Khan dispatched a naval expedition of roughly 20,000 soldiers to punish the Javanese king Kertanagara, who had mutilated a Mongol envoy. The expedition landed successfully and won several engagements, but it was operating at the end of a maritime supply line that stretched thousands of miles, in tropical conditions that were hostile to both soldiers and horses, against a local opponent who understood the terrain intimately. The Javanese prince Raden Wijaya initially allied with the Mongol force to defeat a domestic rival, then turned on the Mongols once his rival was eliminated, attacking the overextended expedition and forcing it to re-embark and sail home. These failures were not anomalies, they were the predictable result of the Mongol system encountering conditions for which it was not designed. The Mongol military machine was optimized for the steppe and the grasslands that bordered it, terrain where horses could graze, where cavalry could maneuver, where the relay communication system could function, and where the army's logistical model, self-sustaining herds moving across open pasture, could operate. When that machine was projected into environments that did not meet those conditions, tropical jungles, island archipelagos, monsoon river systems, its advantages evaporated and its vulnerabilities were exposed. The horses could not graze, the cavalry could not maneuver, the communication network could not extend, and the army, stripped of the mobility and self-sufficiency that were its defining strengths, became a conventional infantry force operating at enormous distance from its base, with no logistical advantage over local defenders who knew the ground. The same principle applied in a different form to the Mongol experience in Japan. Kublai Khan launched two massive naval invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, both of which failed. The first invasion landed a force on the island of Kyushu that won initial engagements against the samurai defenders but was forced to re-embark due to deteriorating weather and the difficulty of maintaining a beachhead without secure supply lines. The second invasion was far larger. Estimates range from 100,000 to 140,000 soldiers carried in a fleet of several thousand ships, and it was destroyed by a typhoon that struck the invasion fleet while it was anchored off the Japanese coast. The Japanese called the storm kamikaze, the divine wind, and attributed their survival to supernatural intervention. But the typhoon was devastating precisely because the Mongol fleet was vulnerable to it, anchored in an exposed position, unable to make landfall in the face of Japanese coastal defences, and dependent on a maritime logistics chain that a single storm could sever. The Japanese campaigns, the Vietnamese campaigns, and the Javanese expedition all point to the same conclusion. The Mongol system had boundaries, and those boundaries were defined not by the courage or the skill of the enemy, though both mattered, but by the physical and logistical conditions of the theatre. Where the conditions matched the system's design parameters, open terrain, adequate grazing, overland communication, enemies who could be reached by cavalry, the Mongols were effectively unstoppable. Where the conditions did not match, water crossings, tropical climate, dense vegetation, maritime supply requirements, the system degraded rapidly, and the empire's campaigns failed. This observation is not meant to diminish the Mongol achievement. Within its operational parameters, the Mongol military system was the most effective instrument of conquest the pre-modern world ever produced. It conquered more territory, defeated more armies, and sustained offensive operations across greater distances than any comparable force in recorded history. But it was a system, not a miracle, and like all systems, it had design limits. Understanding those limits is essential to understanding why the empire expanded where it did, stopped where it did, and eventually fragmented along the lines that it did. The fragmentation itself followed the geographic logic of the system's limitations. The four successor Khanates, the Golden Horde on the western steppe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, each occupied a territory that corresponded to a distinct ecological and logistical zone. The Golden Horde controlled the grasslands where the Mongol cavalry model worked best. The Chagatai Khanate held the Central Asian trade routes and the transitional zone between steppe and settled civilization. The Ilkhanate governed Persia and Mesopotamia, where the Mongol ruling class gradually adapted to the administrative traditions of the Persian world. The Yuan dynasty ruled China, where Kublai Khan built a government that was as much Chinese as it was Mongol, employing Chinese bureaucrats, adopting Chinese court ceremonies, and eventually losing the distinctively Mongol character that had defined the empire's early decades. Each successor state evolved in response to local conditions, and each one drifted further from the unified imperial model that had made the Great Conquest possible. The Golden Horde adopted Islam in the early 14th century and increasingly identified with the Turkic populations it governed. The Ilkhanate did the same. The Yuan dynasty became, in practice, a Chinese imperial house that happened to have Mongol origins. The Chagatai Khanate split into eastern and western halves, each with its own political trajectory. By the mid-14th century, the idea of a single Mongol empire answering to a single great Khan was a legal fiction that no one took seriously. The decline of the successor states followed different timelines but shared common features. Each one faced the challenge of governing settled populations with institutions that had been designed for a nomadic military confederation. Each one struggled with the tension between the Mongol warrior aristocracy and the administrative requirements of a functioning state. Each one experienced succession crises that weakened central authority and empowered local warlords and regional factions. The Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming Rebellion in 1368. The Ilkhanate disintegrated in the 1330s. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented over the course of the 14th century. The Golden Horde lasted longest, maintaining its dominance over the Russian principalities until the late 15th century, but it too eventually succumbed to internal division and the rising power of the Muscovite state. The Timurid Empire, founded by Tamerlane in the late 14th century, represented a partial revival of the Mongol model. Tamerlane claimed legitimacy through the Chinggisid line. He married into the family and styled himself as a restorer of Mongol imperial power, and his military campaigns replicated many features of the Mongol system. Rapid cavalry movement, coordinated multi-axis offensives, the systematic destruction of cities that resisted, and the absorption of conquered military resources into the expanding army. Tamerlane's conquests were spectacular. He sacked Delhi, defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, and briefly reassembled a Central Asian empire that stretched from India to Anatolia. But the Timurid Empire lacked the institutional depth of the original Mongol system. It was held together primarily by Tamerlane's personal authority, and when he died in 1405, it fragmented in exactly the way that pre-Chinggisid steppe empires had always fragmented, into competing. The contrast between the Mongol Empire and the Timurid Empire is the final demonstration of the principle that this documentary has been building toward. Tamerlane had the military talent, he had the tactical brilliance, he had the personal charisma and the ruthlessness. What he did not have, or rather what he did not build, was the institutional framework that could sustain an empire beyond a single leader's lifetime. Chinggis Khan had built that framework. The decimal army, the relay network, the census system, the administrative apparatus, the succession mechanism that, for all its flaws, held the empire together through 3 transfers of power before it finally broke down. It was the framework, not the conquests, that was Chinggis Khan's true achievement. The conquests were what the framework made possible. And that brings us to the strategic lesson that the Mongol experience offers, not as abstract theory, but as a conclusion drawn directly from the campaigns, the sieges, the administrative decisions, and the political crises that we have traced across the span of this narrative. The strategic lesson of the Mongol Empire is deceptively simple to state, and extraordinarily difficult to execute. Sustained military success is not a product of winning battles. It is a product of building systems that convert each victory into the capacity for the next one. Every empire in history has won battles. Most of them stopped expanding or collapsed entirely within a generation of their founding conqueror's death. The Mongols did not stop, not for 3 generations, because the institutional machinery behind the army was designed to do something that no previous steppe confederation and very few settled world empires had ever managed. It was designed to accumulate. The decimal organization accumulated military manpower. Every conquered population was assessed, registered, and integrated into the army's structure, not as auxiliaries fighting under their own chiefs, but as components of a unified chain of command where competence determined rank and loyalty determined survival. A Tangut engineer captured during the Sisha campaign could find himself building catapults at the siege of Samarkand a decade later. A Kipchak horseman defeated on the western steppe could ride in the column that invaded Hungary 5 years afterward. The army did not just replace its losses, it grew with each campaign, because the system was built to absorb the defeated and make them functional. The intelligence system accumulated knowledge. Every diplomatic mission, every merchant contact, every interrogation of captured soldiers produced information that was stored, transmitted through the Urto network and made available to commanders planning the next campaign. Subutai's reconnaissance ride through the Caucasus and southern Russia in 1221 to 1223 was not a one-time adventure. It was the foundation of an operational plan that was executed 15 years later with a precision that would have been impossible without the detailed geographic, military, and political intelligence that expedition had gathered. The Mongol leadership did not treat information as incidental to warfare. They treated it as a prerequisite, and they invested institutional resources in collecting and preserving it on a scale that none of their opponents matched. The logistical system accumulated infrastructure. The Urto relay stations, the grazing schedules, the supply depots, the census records, the tax collection apparatus. All of these expanded with each new territory brought under Mongol control. The empire did not just conquer land, it connected land, linking the pastures of Mongolia to the workshops of northern China, to the trade cities of Central Asia, to the grasslands of the Western Steppe, through a communication and supply network that allowed resources to flow across continental distances. A commander in Persia could request Chinese engineers. A governor in Central Asia could draw on tax revenues collected in the Volga region. The system was not perfectly efficient. No system operating across 6,000 miles with 13th century technology could be. But it was functional enough to sustain the administrative system accumulated governance capacity. The Mongol leadership did not try to impose a single model of government on every conquered territory. They adapted, using Chinese bureaucrats to govern Chinese populations, Persian administrators to manage Persian provinces, and Mongol overseers to ensure that the revenues and military contributions flowed toward the centre. This pragmatism was not ideological tolerance. It was practical recognition that the empire was too large and too diverse to be governed by a single template. The Daragachi system, the appointment of Mongol-authorized governors to administer conquered regions, provided central oversight without requiring central micromanagement. It was a framework that could scale, and it did scale, from the Pacific coast to the Carpathian Mountains. Each of these systems reinforced the others. The intelligence system informed the logistics planning. The logistics system enabled the military campaigns. The military campaigns expanded the territory that the administrative system governed. The administrative system generated the revenues that funded the next round of intelligence gathering, logistics preparation, and military operations. It was a cycle of accumulation that fed itself, and that is why the Mongols did not stop after one kingdom. Stopping would have meant allowing that cycle to stall, and as long as the political centre held, as long as the Great Khan retained authority and the princely branches cooperated, there was no internal reason for the cycle to stop. The machine was built to run. The external reasons it eventually slowed are the ones we have examined in detail: environments that did not suit the system's design, enemies who had time to prepare specific countermeasures, and political fragmentation that severed the connections between the system's components. The jungles of Vietnam, the castles of Hungary, the professional army of the Mamluk Sultanate, the typhoons off the coast of Japan, each of these represented a boundary condition that the Mongol system could not overcome, at least not within the operational and political constraints of the moment, and the succession crises that fractured the empire after 1259 ensured that the full, unified strength of the system would never again be brought to bear against any single obstacle. But notice what those limiting factors have in common. None of them are about battlefield courage. None of them are about individual heroism or moral superiority. They're all about structure, the structure of the environment, the structure of the defense, the structure of the Mongol political system itself. The Mongol Empire was built by structure, and it was ultimately constrained by structure. The armies that defeated or resisted it, the Mamluks, the Hungarians, the Vietnamese, the Japanese, did so not by producing a greater hero or a braver army, but by creating conditions that the Mongol system was not designed to handle. This is the grounded strategic lesson that the Mongol conquests offer, and it applies far beyond the 13th century. Military dominance is never permanent, because every system has design limits, and any opponent with sufficient time and institutional capacity can identify those limits and build around them. The Mongols understood this better than anyone. It was exactly what they had done to their own opponents, studying each enemy's vulnerabilities and designing campaigns that exploited them. The irony is that the same principle eventually applied to the Mongols themselves. The Mamluks studied the Mongol system and built a counter. The Hungarians studied their own catastrophic defeat and rebuilt their entire kingdom around the lessons they had learned. The Vietnamese used terrain and climate to impose conditions that the Mongol system could not overcome. In each case, the successful defense was not a reaction, it was a preparation. It was the product of years of investment, reform, and institutional adaptation carried out before the crisis arrived. The Mongol Empire remains, 8 centuries later, the most dramatic demonstration. It did not do this because the Mongols were superhuman. It did not do this because steppe nomads possessed some innate military gift that settled civilizations lacked. It did this because one man, Chinggis Khan, and the generation of commanders and administrators who worked alongside him built an organizational system that was better designed, more adaptable, and more scalable than anything the world had previously seen. The decimal army broke the tribal structure that had fragmented every earlier confederation. The relay network enabled coordination across distances that should have been unmanageable. The intelligence system provided the information that allowed campaigns to be planned with operational precision. The administrative framework converted conquered territory into productive imperial assets rather than ungovernable wastelands. And the policy of absorbing defeated peoples and foreign technologies into the system ensured that the empire grew more capable with each expansion, rather than more brittle. The system was not perfect. Its succession mechanism was its most critical weakness, and that weakness ultimately proved fatal to the unity of the empire. But for roughly 70 years, from the first campaigns against Xixia in 1209 to the fragmentation that followed Munka's death in 1259, the Mongol Empire operated as the most effective military organization the pre-modern world had ever produced, and its campaigns during that period remain some of the most remarkable feats of coordinated military action in the entire human record. The last question worth asking is not why the Mongol Empire fell, all empires fall, but why it lasted as long as it did, and what that duration tells us about the relationship between military power and institutional design. Every step confederation before the Mongols had followed the same trajectory. A charismatic leader would unite the tribes, win a string of victories, extract tribute or territory from a neighbouring settled state, and then die, at which point the confederation would fracture along tribal lines, the constituent groups would ride home, and the cycle would reset. The Xiongnu Confederation lasted roughly a century before splitting into northern and southern halves. The Gokturk Empire fragmented within 2 generations of its founding. The Uyghur Khaganate endured for about a century before being destroyed by the Kyrgyz. The pattern was so consistent that Chinese strategists built their entire steppe policy around it, contain the nomads during their period of strength, exploit their internal divisions when the inevitable fragmentation came, and wait for the cycle to repeat. Chinggis Khan broke that cycle. Not permanently, the Mongol Empire did eventually fragment, but long enough and thoroughly enough to accomplish something that no previous steppe power had come close to achieving. The question is how, and the answer is not military genius, though Chinggis Khan possessed that in abundance. The answer is that he identified the specific structural weaknesses that had destroyed every previous confederation and built specific institutional countermeasures against each one. The tribal loyalty problem, the tendency of nomadic warriors to follow their clan chief rather than the confederate leader, was addressed by the decimal reorganization, which mixed tribal groups together in units defined by the chain of command rather than by kinship. The succession problem, the tendency of the leader's death to trigger immediate fragmentation, was addressed by the appanage system and the Kurultai mechanism, which gave each branch of the family a defined stake in the empire and a formal process for selecting the next leader. The administrative problem, the inability of nomadic rulers to govern settled populations, was addressed by the Daragachi system and the policy of employing local administrators under Mongol oversight. The communication problem, the impossibility of coordinating action across vast distances, was addressed by the Urto relay network. The military technology problem, the inability of steppe cavalry to take fortified cities, was addressed by the systematic absorption of siege engineers and military specialists from conquered civilizations. None of these solutions was perfect. The decimal system generated resentment among tribal aristocrats who lost their hereditary authority. The succession mechanism failed to prevent civil war after Munka's death. The administrative system was often brutal and extractive, generating resistance that required ongoing military suppression. The Urto network was but the solutions did not need to be perfect. They needed to be better than anything that had existed before, and they were, by a wide margin. The decimal army held together through 4 decades of continuous campaigning across multiple continents. The succession mechanism transferred power 3 times before it broke down, 3 more successful transitions than any previous steppe confederation had managed. The administrative system generated enough revenue to fund sustained military operations on a scale that dwarfed anything the steppe had previously produced. The Ertur enabled strategic coordination across 6,000 miles, a capability that would not be matched until the advent of the electric telegraph in the 19th century. Each solution bought time, and the accumulated time was enough to build an empire that reshaped the world. The Mongol Empire was, in the end, an answer to a problem that had existed for as long as the steppe itself. The problem of how to turn the military advantages of nomadic life into durable political power. Every previous attempt had failed because the social structure of nomadic society, decentralized, kinship-based, resistant to permanent hierarchy, worked against the centralization that empire required. Chinggis Khan did not eliminate that tension. He managed it through institutions that were strong enough to hold the centrifugal forces in check for as long as the empire's leadership remained competent and the external momentum of conquest continued. When the leadership fractured and the momentum stalled, the old forces reasserted themselves and the empire broke apart along lines that would have been recognizable to any observer of steppe politics in any previous century. But the 70 years during which the system held were enough to conquer the largest contiguous land empire in history, enough to connect the civilizations of East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East and Europe into a single economic and informational network for the first time, enough to transfer technologies, gunpowder, printing, navigational knowledge, administrative techniques, across continental distances in a fraction of the time that diffusion would normally have required, enough to destroy political orders that had endured for centuries and to create new ones that would endure for centuries more, enough to demonstrate conclusively and permanently that organizational design is the decisive factor in sustained military success, more important than numbers, more important than individual talent, more important than bravery, and more important than any single technological advantage. The Mongol horse archer was a formidable warrior, but a formidable warrior without a system behind him is just a raider. What made the Mongol Empire was not the warrior. It was the system that told him where to ride, when to attack, how to coordinate with forces he could not see, and what to do with the territory he conquered. That system was Chinggis Khan's true legacy, and it is the reason that a minor tribal chief born on the margins of the eastern steppe in the 12th century remains, 800 years later, one of the most consequential figures in the history of human civilization. The Mongols did not stop after conquering one kingdom, because their empire was not built to stop. It was built to accumulate power, knowledge, territory, and capability through a set of institutions that turned each conquest into the foundation for the next. It kept going until the institutions that drove it forward could no longer contain the political forces that pulled it apart. And in the span between those two moments, between the founding and the fracture, it changed the world more thoroughly than any single political entity before or since. If this documentary helped you understand how and why that happened, not through myth or exaggeration, but through the concrete details of campaigns, logistics, command structures, and institutional design, then it has done its job. If you want to see more long-form historical analysis like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the empire, campaign, or battle you want examined next. There is no shortage of material, and the real history is always more interesting than the legend. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, not a story of invincible warriors or supernatural destiny, a story of organization, built from the ground